Thank you. So welcome to day two of the Climate Attributes Workshop. Robin Harkless with Oregon Consensus. This morning, I just wanted to tee us up for the morning, which is an opportunity for the state, particularly the two state agencies leading this effort, to be in conversation with some of our tribal partners about this work. We're here, we have folks in the room as well as online. So we'll start with just some introductions of our tribal partners, give an opportunity to just open the conversation about what climate resilience means to the tribes. And then we'll have an opportunity for Sarah and Debbie to share kind of where we've gotten to this point with the work and the drafts of the work. And hopefully just spend a nice kind of open space morning for the tribes and the agencies to talk together about getting feedback, asking questions. So for those of you who are not directly in this conversation this morning, you may have questions. I know there were some that were developed yesterday afternoon. We've got those waiting as well. But if you do, during the course of the conversation this morning, if you've just got a really burning question that you'd love to get in the queue, feel free to just write that down on a Post-it note. You can hand it to Bobby, you can hand it to me, and we'll try to help kind of bring that into either this conversation this morning, or at some point we'll have sort of culminated those and we'll iterate through this because this won't be the last stop for this work. So we're just really, really glad and appreciative that folks are here making the time today. So I'm going to just open this up for intros, and we have one of our tribal partners here in the room, Steve Rondo. Steve, so welcome, and feel free to introduce yourself and anything you'd want to say at the outset about what climate resilience means to Klamath Tribe.
Sure, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to join you. My name is Steve Rondo. I'm the Natural Resources Director for the Klamath Tribes. I've worked for the Klamath Tribes about 13 years, and the Natural Resources Director position for about 6. I'm a member of the Cow Creek Tribe. However, I grew up in Forks, Washington, so a small town up in Washington on the coast, a logging community. And so, come from a place where family worked out in the woods and we lived out in the woods and, recreated, and really, it was abundant and we had plenty of opportunities up there. But, about 15, 16 years ago, I moved down to Roseburg, and I was the director of the Cow Creek Tribes Natural Resources for a few years there before moving over to the Klamath Tribes. So I'd also like to say that I don't speak for everybody within the Klamath Tribes even, and especially Native Americans. So I'm just coming from one perspective, and my perspective is the natural resources side. And in the Klamath Tribes, we also have an OMBODOT department, which means on the water. So they focus on water issues. And I usually focus mostly on terrestrial issues. So, when it comes to climate resilience, I think, recognizing the world around us today and the speed at which things happen, they're much faster. And it kind of, I think, pushes us into an area to where we think a little bit more short term, and coming from a tribal perspective, we think a lot more long term. And so we're not always focused on how we can extract resources and use them for our benefit, but how we belong together. They're our family, they're our relation, and we need to take care of them, and we're interconnected with them. They're our relatives. And so, it's reciprocal in nature. And so what we give, we get back. And, but things have changed a lot over time. So it's put tribes in a position to where we're having to be effective in modern day way of things and still try to, be connected with the land, and be out there and tend our resources and protect those things that are important to ourselves and future generations. So climate resilience is something that we wouldn't necessarily be so concerned about from a tribal perspective historically. There's been fluctuations throughout history, and there's been cataclysms and things that have really affected cultures over time. And so, again, with a long-term way of thinking, we would have tended the landscape in a way that it probably would have been in a position to handle situations like we're seeing today. Of course, we're certainly seeing some pretty major changes. It's happened certainly recently on the Klamath Tribes Reservation, and whether it's through the water situation there or the wildfires that have burned recently, the landscape is really on the edge of the desert. And the Klamath Tribes is made up of 3 tribes, and Klamath, Modoc, and Yahuskin. And Yahuskin are Snake Indians, so they're more desert people. And so that's where we're just on the edge of the high desert down there. And what we found is that it's closing in on us, and it's starting to reduce some of the viability of the forests, and places where even the Bootleg fire burned through, which was 420,000 acres, burned a quarter of the tribe's reservation. We're not able to see the same type of ability to reestablish forests. And so we've watched a lot of planting efforts where they're spending millions of dollars trying to plant trees, but they're not necessarily recognizing that it's a drought year and none of those trees survive. And now it's becoming more common in a manner that they're having less survival in those types of things than they really did even before that. So at the same time, I'd like to say that a lot of the tribal people do work with each other and listen to their elders. And so the information that they receive is coming down from former generations, but things have changed so dramatically that we're having to address it in different ways. And nowadays, if you disagree on something, a lot of times you end up in court. And so traditional ecological knowledge doesn't get you very far in court. And so what we've done is we've worked with scientists and we've performed research in order to support the concepts that we hear from our elders. And we've been fairly successful in doing so, and showing kind of the historical condition of the lands, and then how they've changed over time. And so, we are classically trained in science as well, but we're also trying to weave that together with the culture and the way things have been done in the past. So I think the best we can do is to continue to evolve and move forward, and a caution to say the word assimilate, but we're being forced to. So we do have kind of multi-pronged approach where my department is really focused on research and science and then implementation of restoration. But we're getting the lead from our elders and our committees that recognize that things are getting worse on the landscape and they need to be improved. So probably the last thing I would say is that I think that we probably focus on the monetary aspects of things a little bit more than the actual health of the system. And we measure things in money rather than our own health. And so we have a lot of sick and unhealthy people, largely because it's the foods we eat and the way we live our lives today. And those first foods out on the landscape are not out there in the way they used to be historically, which tribes would have tended in place and cultivated. And so we're having a challenge when it comes to even finding cultural plants in the places they were historically, and then the condition in which they're in, whether they're nutritious or not. So this largely on the landscape I work in is fire dependent, very fire dependent ponderosa pine forests. And so tribes historically, culturally would have burned areas. And I think that that's something that all of us can do is go out on the land and if we're close enough to it, we just recognize how it's probably not the most healthy condition and what we might do to improve it. And the answer in our place is fire. So prescribed burning is becoming a big part of what we're doing. We recently stood up a fire program and have been operating for little over 2 years now and trying to get fire back on the landscape. And so, with some of the research and history and knowledge that we're using, we're finding that we can implement fire and we can still have those monetary values intact, whether it's timber or other resources. And so, I think it would be, we can improve things if we all came a little closer to the middle, instead of the way things have been for a while, where tribes are just having to, really hook our trailer up to the mainstream and where the money is and where the opportunities are, and what we are forced to do in order to address the health concerns that we have with people. The challenges we have with personally, I've had staff that if you they're seasonals, and if you lay them off, sometimes they end up in prison or no longer alive. And so it really is important that we all have opportunities to go out and be part of the landscape and find meaning in doing so. I think that it's something that is becoming a little bit lost. And sometimes I feel like, our culture is divided and it's a little bit lost, but the thing that we have in common and the thing we need to protect are really our lands and our landscapes. And if we did so in a good way, I think that we would have less of a challenge in front of us when it comes to the changing climate.
There's no way to turn them off, but they're not super sensitive, so it's okay.
Thank you, Steve. We have a few more partners that are with us online. So Anton, I see you. Are you there with us? There you are.
I am. Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yeah, and I would just, if you're not speaking from the virtual platform, you're welcome to just turn your video off for this portion of the day. Thanks. All right, welcome.
Thanks, Robin. Good morning, all. My name is Anton Kiono. I am staff for the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla Indian Reservation in the Department of Natural Resources. I believe we had Troy Baker with you for part of the day yesterday. He's our Water Resources Program Manager. He might be here today for some of this. We're also hoping we might have Eric Klemps at some point this morning, our Director for the Department of Natural Resources, but it's a busy week for all of us, so we apologize that our participation is a little bit sparser than we'd like. Nonetheless, we're very happy to be here and thank you for the time on this and for the governor's executive order. I don't know that I will add a lot right now. I think one of the themes that really comes up, well, maybe two of the themes that really come up for the Confederated Tribes are the following. The first is, when we think about the management of both natural landscapes and working landscapes, it's very important to the Umatilla tribes to focus on ensuring that the ecosystem processes are functioning. And some of you might be familiar with the River Vision and Upland Vision guidance documents that we have at the tribes here that guide how we manage natural landscapes. And instead of focusing so much on discrete outputs from these different types of ecosystems, these vision documents try to focus on the processes and ensuring that the ecosystem processes, both over time and space, are functioning. And if they're not, trying to find ways to restore those processes, and then having faith that if the ecosystem is healthy and functioning itself, it will produce those more discrete outputs that are very important to the tribes. Things such as the tribe's first foods, like clean, fresh water, salmon, roots and berries, game species, the things that have been very important to the tribes since time immemorial for both cultural purposes and subsistence. So that's really a central thrust of how we approach natural resource management, again, irrespective of whether or not it's on more natural landscapes or more working landscapes. I think the second thing that we certainly want to underscore in this whole endeavor is recognizing before we can build for the future, which I think we're trying to do today, we have to have a firm foundation. And unfortunately, I think our foundation remains a little shaky in a lot of respects. We have Oregon has a lot of great progressive laws and regulations on the state to try to facilitate natural resource conservation and protection. I think unfortunately we're still falling a bit short in implementing those faithfully to the intent of those laws and regulations. And I have some specific examples when we want to get into those details. But I think that's something that's important to keep in mind. While it's critical that we plan for the future, we also have to make sure that the foundation we're building upon is very firm, or anything that we try to build for that future, won't have that structural integrity that we really need. So looking forward, very important, but I think we also need to kind of look back at what we already have and make sure that those tools, those processes, those funding opportunities are performing as intended. And I think unfortunately, there's still some examples where that's not the case. So those are just a couple comments, sort of how we're thinking about this morning. And as I said, we're very happy to be here. We appreciate this being convened and look forward to working with you to make this a very strong product. So thank you.
Thanks, Anton.
Thank you, Anton. All right, looks like Kelly Coates. Are you up there on the Zoom? Kelly might be joining us in the room later today, as I understand it.
Actually, I think she may be on the phone now and then joining virtually later today.
Great. So Kelly, can you hear us?
Yes. Can you all hear me?
We can. Yes. Welcome.
Good. Yes, I'm joining from the car for about 15 minutes, and I will be at my desk. So, Bedu, Kelly Coates Purika, Nahanko Dana Aete. Good day. Kelly Coates is my name, and I am of the Cow Creek Umpqua people. I'm the director of natural resources for the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians, and I'm also a Cow Creek Umpqua tribal member. I just want to thank you all for the invitation to be a part of the conversation today. I appreciate the space for tribes. It's hard following up on what Steve and Anton both said, simply because they put it so eloquently, a lot of the same concerns that we have as a tribe as well. Our outlook for sort of building a resilient future, as Anton mentioned, builds on the past and our traditional knowledge. Also looking at what we're dealing with today. As Steve mentioned, I think a lot of us are facing the same issues, primarily for Cow Creek. We're looking at drought conditions. We're also looking at catastrophic wildfire impacting our lands, and how we adjust what we're doing to preserve the lands into the future, and also ensure that our culturally significant species, many of them first food sources for the tribe, are here for our future generations. And I think the one thing that I have found over my career is that there are a lot of people that will say, well, this one specific area isn't going to shake out too well in the future given climate predictions. So should we waste our time and money in that area? And my answer to that is yes, especially for our tribe, because we are inextricably tied to our lands and we are not going anywhere. And so we don't want to see species blink out on our watch. And we feel like it's important to recognize climate change and the effects that it's going to have, but also not to give up on some of those species. For example, we have spring Chinook in the South Umpqua River system that have been on the brink of extinction since the early 90s. And we're very concerned about that species, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to do the work given the climate predictions for warming temperatures within that watershed. That doesn't mean we're not going to give up on that area. It doesn't mean we're going to shift to an area that may do better in the future. And I understand that a lot of these questions do get back to the financial part of things and only having so many resources to go around. And I 100% understand that, especially given our current funding situation and what we're looking at with the state and the federal government. However, I think it does get back to that need to really look holistically at what we're doing and make the ties, because as a tribe, we're not just focused on a single species. If we do work for a species, we also look at the interconnectedness and the effects of us doing work for a single species and what that equates to for other species or that entire ecosystem. And so I think sometimes we can get a little myopic when we're looking at funding something to restore a specific species, but I think we need to broaden it. And I feel like tribes have been doing a really good job of this. For example, most of the funding that's out there for fisheries restoration work is for coho. We all know this, right? At least on the west side. But when we do a coho restoration project, we don't just focus on the benefits for coho. We look at, okay, do we have spring Chinook in this area too? Do we have fall Chinook in this area? Do we have Pacific lamprey? What can we do with this restoration project that, yes, is a coho restoration project, but also provides other benefits for other species to get the biggest bang for our buck? And I think we need to acknowledge that, because as the funding gets thinner, we're gonna have to apply it in a way that it goes further for multiple species. The tribe right now is in the process of writing a climate adaptation plan. So we've been working with Adaptation International on this. We're weaving together our cultural and traditional knowledge, as well as Western science, climate predictions into the future, and also really taking a hard look at management into the future and what we would like to do. You know, if we had a money tree and all of the available resources for it, but also then whittling it down to what is possible for us to do as well. So these are some hard questions to ask ourselves as we're moving forward, but they're incredibly important. And I would just say, I think one of the keys for building a resilient state or a resilient community is that we do need to find a way to work together more so, I think, than we have been, and also find a way that we can make the funding go a little further, but not forget about some of those other species that aren't the charismatic megafauna or the ones that are on the Endangered Species Act list, but species that are incredibly important keystone species that are a key piece of the ecology of our systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. Safe travels. Troy just joined us. Troy Baker. We're just doing introductions, and anything you'd like to add just up front about a perspective from the tribe. I don't see.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Troy
Oh,
Baker.
there you
I'm
are.
with the Department of Natural Resources here with the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. First, I just want to say thank you for allowing us the opportunity to participate. In my work with the tribal natural resource staff, resilience is often framed in terms of whether ecosystems continue to sustain first foods and the relationship communities have with land and water. From that perspective, resilient landscapes are ones that really are where ecological processes like hydrology, floodplain connectivity, habitat complexity, and species interactions are functioning in ways that really allow the foods and relationships to persist over time. So again, thank you for allowing us to participate, and I look forward to the discussions that we're going to have today.
Thank you, Troy. Any other tribal partners that we haven't yet recognized that might be up on Zoom or even in the room? Okay, so we'll shift gears back to the agencies, Sarah O'Brien and Debbie Colbert. I think we have some slides to kind of help carry this part of the conversation. So we'll pull those up on your behalf and take it away.
Good morning, Steve, Anton, Kelly, Troy. Really appreciate the kind of introductory remarks, and thank you so much for being a part of this conversation with us today. I'm Debbie Colbert, the Director of the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Sarah O'Brien, Director of the OWEB, the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board.
We wanted to just give you a little bit of a backdrop to the work that we are doing this week as part of the governor's executive order on resilient waters, lands, and communities. And really, the way that we have been describing the executive order at a high level is an opportunity for the governor to essentially look for a North Star for the natural resource agencies as they are delivering their programs. So, how do we work more effectively across all of the agencies to achieve resilient land and waters? We heard from Jeff Huntington yesterday that this is not so much about a new funding effort, but really looking at the footprint of the state executive branch and asking ourselves, how do we deploy that across all of our agencies more effectively and better alignment to achieve resilient lands and waters? I think there's also kind of, as we've embarked on this effort, which Sarah and I were essentially charged with a portion of this executive order, which is trying to come up with a subset of attributes. So when we see a landscape and it has these particular attributes, it's a sign that it is a high functioning, resilient landscape, the lands and waters. And so our assignment was to develop a set of attributes. And so we've been in conversation over the course of the day. We're going to tell you a little bit about kind of the process that we've used so far, and some of kind of what we've synthesized as a group so far. But as we've been going through this, we've really recognized that this is an iterative process, and that, we're not going to get to perfection, but we're going to make a really great start at identifying some of those key attributes and possibly some indicators of, what those attributes might look like on a landscape. Anything else to add to just kind of the assignment itself, Sarah?
Keep going. I'll chime in.
Okay. All right. Well, you want to go on?
Steve and Troy were here part of
Yes,
yesterday
yes.
too. So I just want to acknowledge you've been trying.
Absolutely. We're kind of just starting with a fresh plate today. So, so why don't we go to the next? And Sarah, you want to talk about just the terminology we've been using over the course of the last day or so?
Sure. And I think that probably the main thing to note here is that what we have envisioned is this sort of cascading step-by-step of like an attribute at the highest level that's statewide in applicability. And that's a lot of what we were wrestling with yesterday. steps down to an indicator that's a more specific observable feature, condition, or maybe state of a process, to get to Anton's comment, which then steps down to a metric. And part of what is in the rest of the executive order is that the state agencies are expected to identify some metrics and attributes that we can make progress towards in specific proportions over a specific timeline. And so, I think we knew upfront that if we didn't provide some clear language and stick to it, we'd go around in circles in definition. I do want to note, a lot of folks use this kind of structure, and Anton mentioned the River Vision and Upland Vision documents earlier today that the Umatilla tribes have developed. Really follows a similar structure, and so hopefully this feels pretty familiar to folks. So the focus here has really been on attributes. Folks who were here in the room or online yesterday will remember we started digging a little deeper, in part to just kind of ground truth our efforts, but that's the structure we're aiming for. Next slide. How about if I do one or two more of these? Is that okay? The slide that we pulled up here is a reflection from yesterday. We basically started with the attributes that folks see in the memo, and I'm aware that there are about 30 people watching me who were here for this, and you can check my accuracy later and tell me about it. You can check my accuracy now and tell me about it later. We took those, I think they were 7 or 8 kind of draft attribute categories that were described in the memo, in section 4 of the memo, and started identifying which of those really resonated for people, which of them had statewide applicability, which of them seemed the most important. And by midday, we had sort of landed on these broad categories, and there was a lot of agreement that oval stewardship was something that contributed to, applied to, sort of served as a filter of all the other attributes, and was sort of the predecessor to being able to achieve, increased resiliency or maintain resiliency of the other attributes. So this was where we landed. And then, as folks may remember, in the afternoon, we thought, okay, well, let's kind of test those by starting to get to deeper and deeper detail and think, okay, if we were applying this in a specific place or a specific resource type, how would this work, and kind of ground truth whether those attributes are something that would work to start stepping down. Can you go to the next slide? Sure. Sorry, it doesn't have a long leash on it. Yeah, and so I will say we did a little work after you all left yesterday. So there were some great conversations in the afternoon. They were both broad and deep, and there were a lot of sticky notes at the end of it. So this will not be an attempt to comprehensively capture everything that folks in the room talked about, but we did start to see some common themes that we thought would be really important to share with our tribal government partners today, and just check our work and ask, like, how are we doing? Is this resonating? Does this make sense? What should we keep in mind, knowing that we're shoulder to shoulder in a lot of these resource management challenges and opportunities, and we want to be aiming for a North Star that makes sense in our collaborative and our government-to-government work together. So Debbie's going to tell us what all the answers were, as it turns out.
Well, so what you're going to see next is 2 versions of our kind of synthesis. The first one is written as sentences, and the second one is more of a visual. And what we realized after everyone left the room yesterday is that we spent a lot of time using single words as a substitute, and we just felt like, okay, if we use a sentence, we can be more clear about what we mean, and make sure that the words that we are all combining around something like connectivity, that we're talking, and actually meaning the same thing. So we took a crack at writing it down as sentences, and so again, our assignment was attributes of resilient lands and waters. So I'm gonna read it out, especially because we have some folks that are not, I think, at a place where they can see our slides. So just want to make sure that they can hear the words that we've laid out. So resilient lands and waters have connectivity across watersheds and landscapes in both terrestrial and aquatic systems that allow for movement of fish, wildlife, and ecological processes. And again, This is connectivity at its broadest sense. It includes the discussions that we had about sediment transport and, wildlife movement. The next is resilient lands and waters have diverse habitats, species, and physical landscapes that provide options for responding to change and disturbance. Resilient lands and waters have space and capacity for systems to absorb, adapt, and recover from disturbances like fire, flood, and drought. And again, we had a lot of conversation about just giving rivers space and then the last attribute that we wrote out, resilient lands and waters have an ability to sustain communities, livelihoods, and economies. You want to take the next one?
You do that one?
Sure. And then maybe that just goes right into the visual.
Sure. As we were talking through those sentences last night, it struck us that the relationship in our conversation, the relationship between people and nature, was expressed in actually two different directions. And one of those was on the first, that we know that it is an indicator, an attribute of resilient lands and waters, that they have the ability to, continue to sustain communities and livelihoods and economies and lifeways. And the flip side of stewardship came up a lot too. So that kind of creates a different sentence structure, which is that we know that resilient lands and waters, and Steve, you hit on this as well, are sustained and stewarded by people who are in place-based relationship with nature. They're engaging with their watershed. They're engaging with stewardship on their lands. And we know that that's both a cause of more resilient landscapes and a sign that people are there doing active stewardship and paying attention to changes in the landscape. And so we wanted to make sure to capture that. If you go to the next slide, it struck us also yesterday afternoon that there seemed to be a order of operations or kind of a causal link between a lot of the indicators actually. And so, the person that usually helps us put graphical ideas into a compelling and graceful form, I failed to invite to the meeting, which was a bad choice because then I was doing this on PowerPoint last night and it was not very graceful. But what we're trying to get at is that there is a lot of work that goes on in the relationship between these attributes too. And I think that's why for many of us, the conversations that we had yesterday started to feel a little swirly as we would start talking about complexity. And then we would find we were talking about diversity, or we'd start talking about diversity and find that we had landed in adaptive capacity. And so there may be a more sort of linear directionality to some of these, but as kind of a placeholder while we think that through and talk it through and continue our work today and tomorrow, we just wanted to show that those are inextricably linked and sort of surrounded by this like warm hug of sustained stewardship by people. So that's what that light gray circle is aiming to depict. So some folks may notice there were a couple of attributes that were on the earlier slide that didn't make our sentences list. We'd welcome feedback on that today from our tribal government partners and from others later in the day. Complexity, when anybody tried to get down to talking about more specific indicators of complexity, it seemed to really merge with diversity and then disappear completely. It turned out to be really hard to run down to a level of specific detail that allowed us to, as Debbie said, when we tried to put it into a sentence, we unintentionally sort of disciplined ourselves on vague language. And so when we couldn't find a verb for it, we realized we were in trouble. So, we can talk about bringing some of that stuff back, but is there a complexity that's not reflected in the description of diversity, where we include, physical features and processes as well as species and habitats? Is there another nature of complexity there? Redundancy is another one that came up and then kind of seemed to merge with other categories. And at the end of the day, I think it seemed redundant. So then we were stuck. So that's kind of the work that we've done so far, that we'd really welcome our tribal partners' reflections on there. What's resonating, what's not, what would you suggest changing or adding, what's missing? And then I think we did have some other discussion questions that I shared by email late last night that came out of this group's conversations late in the day of what, what would we specifically like to discuss? So if we run out of things to talk about, we have a whole slide of discussion questions too, but just would really welcome, feedback. And I recognize, Robin, this is awkward to facilitate in a hybrid environment. So if you have advice on how we dig in, maybe we can hand the mic to Steve for any initial reflections and then shift to the online room. Oh, go ahead, Debbie.
I
Sorry.
was only going to add that just kind of as we created those four attributes in the center, we also were playing around with some of the indicators that we discussed yesterday. And it became clear, kind of to Sarah's point, that there's going to be some indicators that actually could go under more than one category. So again, there's just so much interconnectedness that I think it's going to be clear as we move forward with the next phase.
Steve, you're a good person to dig in because you were here. So how did we do? What did you think?
I think you guys did great. Coming from the tribal perspective, I think that, one thing I've recognized through time is that we start with the whole instead of the parts. And I think that, I've recognized, whether it's working with some of our researchers or professors at colleges, is that they're always, coming up with new information and then slightly modifying the way that they go about things based on that new information. And then the next day there's new information. And so, it just made me realize that, I can't keep trying to follow all of academia and where it's going and the things that they're learning, because I have a sense of what is good and feels right on the landscape. And it's just a lifetime of being on it. And so I think the way what you guys have put up here as a list is excellent. I can't think of any like additions or subtractions. And again, like, talking about how you're having difficulty when you're talking about complexity and verse. That's right, because it's a whole and we're looking at the parts first. So, but I think it's a good list and it does bring together the whole.
Thanks. It's helpful. That's why I dropped out of my PhD program, by the way. I realized I could never keep up.
So let's welcome our other tribal partners forward that are on Zoom with us. So Anton and Kelly and Troy, if you're welcome to come on screen and take yourself off mute and just provide some initial feedback to the agencies about this framework. And I think Sarah's questions were what resonates, what's missing, any questions that you might have. See you, Anton.
May I jump in then?
Yeah.
Okay, and I apologize. I'm just seeing what's on the screen here. I'm assuming these things describe a resilient landscape. Is that right? Sorry, dumb question.
Resilient land and waters.
Okay, thank you. These are fantastic. The one thing I wonder about is where do we incorporate that notion of function and the health of the function itself? And that might be implicit in here, but I don't know. Is that something that we want to call out a little bit more, that we want to see resilient landscapes have resilient functioning processes as well?
Anton, I see a lot of nodding in the room, and that's actually after your opening comments exactly what I wanted to ask you, which is this like, can we show process and function in each of these categories, or is it a separate attribute? And I don't know, it might be helpful to just think about, or to ask you to tell us a little bit about how that's been represented in the River Vision and Upland Vision, that we can think about using that as a model.
I think the four things that we have here are terrific. I'm reluctant to make things even more unwieldy, but it almost seems like healthy functioning processes might be something else that needs to be added to this if there's a fifth slice of the pie. But I don't know. It's certainly worth more thought, and we have lots of smart people here today, so I welcome other thoughts on it, of course.
Anything else you want to add, Anton?
That was the very tiny little bit I have for now. Thank you.
I think it could be a small circle in the middle, maybe, Anton, that also applies to all of those. I'm kind of a visual thinker. I get lost in words, so I can kind of see that. I think that'd be a good thing to kick around with the group later today.
I like that.
All right. We'll weave that into the work this afternoon. Thank you. Kelly. She might be
Hi.
there she is.
Okay. Sorry, I'm attempting to get set up on my computer here. So, um, I really appreciate the visuals. If we can incorporate a Venn diagram into this, I would love that. Love a good Venn diagram. I think this is pretty good. Uh, I I really like this visual and I like what's been captured here. I like that it's the feedback is going both ways. I think that's incredibly important. Um, I tend to agree with Anton on this. I think maybe adding a little bit about the processes, healthy processes would be good simply because there are so many, like the ecological processes are so important that it isn't necessarily just about the species and the habitat. It's about the process and the interaction of the species with the habitats and the interaction of people and the landscapes as well. So, yeah, I think that's all for now.
All right. And Troy, are you still on Zoom with us?
Yes, I am. I think these are great. And the only point that I think that I'd like to make here is our vision documents also emphasize access and, for ensuring that people are able to reach and benefit from the resources. And how would that fit in this? I guess is my question.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think another good piece of food for thought for us as we move forward. Bobby, what would you think of skipping forward to one of the attribute slides that we're gonna work on later today, just to give folks a glimpse of where we're headed and maybe ask advice on that? Or should we go to the discussion questions, do you think? Robin's facilitating, but you're flipping slides, so this is confusing.
We're a team. We're a team. We're trying to be seamless here, but I do have questions. I'm wondering if you have questions to kind of take this conversation a little bit deeper. So you're getting feedback on kind of a higher level framework. Do you want to go a step further and start to, and maybe it is through showing kind of how you're thinking about attributes and indicators as a next step in conversation? And then we do have a series of questions, even some follow-up from what we've heard this morning. So if there's time, it'd be great to get into some of that.
Easy enough to show one of the attributes.
Yeah.
Why don't you share us?
Connectivity would be one. Sustain, the sustain one might have some of the access in terms of stuff in it.
Pick one. So this is a sneak peek actually for everybody in the room. This is as we were collecting and working through all the sticky notes last night, we started to see sort of some patterns and some consistency in what happened when we started to step down from attributes. And we started to imagine what a document that results from this work might look like. That could sort of set in greater description and detail some of the concepts that we're talking about. So what we wanted to continue working on later today and continue to build out is the structure of like a more detailed sentence version of the attribute, a little short description, like a short paragraph that would allow us to provide some more depth and complexity to each of these concepts. And then a set of example indicators. So going down to that next step in the attribute, indicator, metric. It's not a hierarchy. I don't know what it is, step thing. And So that's where we're going to be headed this afternoon. Steve, I think that you're able to stick with us, and I hope others might be able to join as well. But I'm curious if you have any advice as we dive into this afternoon, or sort of reflections on similar planning efforts within tribal natural resource departments. If you can help us at all see the road ahead of how we might start building this out and what sort of challenges or opportunities or pitfalls we might encounter. Yeah, and so Bobby's pulled up a version here that has some more relevance to some of the issues folks brought up in this conversation of, our lands being managed in a way that contributes to tribal sovereignty, tribal treaty rights. Is hunting and fishing sustained, and is access sustained, I think, as Troy mentioned, would be part of that. I feel like we're throwing a lot of content at you very quickly here and asking for feedback, but I'm curious whether this prompts any more discussion or guidance in folks' minds.
Sarah, are you just seeking feedback from the tribal?
From tribal staff, yeah, and then we'll continue this with the full group later this afternoon.
May I weigh in again?
Of course, Anton.
Thank you. This is where I wonder about an attribute that reflects that we need to make sure that the laws and rules and regulations and programs we have on the book are being used effectively on resilient landscapes. I feel like we can't have, again, it gets back to that analogy of a shaky foundation. How can we build resilient landscapes, resilient lands and waters if the tools we have right now aren't being implemented effectively or to their intent? So I don't know if there's some way to reflect that as an attribute or something like that, but I think that's just critically important.
I think our first discussion question will actually take us back to that too. So I guess Steve, Troy, Kelly, any other thoughts before we maybe switch back to the higher level with the discussion questions? No.
I'd like to make a comment on access again. I think, when you dive into our vision documents, access really is treated as a precondition for communities to benefit from ecosystems. And so I think it really, because it describes a broader landscape condition, I think it fits well as an attribute instead of an indicator for an attribute.
That's great. Thank you for that, Troy. Bobby's taking notes in real time, and then I'll ask him to switch to the questions slide.
Yeah, and in the meantime, Kelly, if you have anything to add to this.
For those of you who weren't with us yesterday, it feels like we probably have asked you to jump into a pool that we've been treading neatly in for 24 hours. So I apologize if that was too much content too fast. Really looking forward to feedback.
No, we like to immersion learn at tribes. It's what we do all the time. So this is fine. No, I don't have any initial thoughts on that. I actually really appreciate how well you captured everything from yesterday. I think that's been really helpful for me. And I think the points that you had on the table were really good. So I don't have anything to add to that right now.
So let's go into some of the more specific questions. The first one being about barriers to managing for resilience right now. Maybe a little finer point, Anton, that you made this morning, which is around kind of shaky foundation as a potential barrier. Do you want to say more about that?
I would love to say more about that. Thanks, Robin. And of course, please always recognize these comments are in the spirit of trying to be helpful and constructive and aren't critical in any way. But yeah, we really run into challenges. I cut my teeth on water law and policy, so that's where my perspective is coming from in many cases. And when we think about water issues in particular, there are lots of challenges to the effective implementation of the protections we have right now. One example of that is in-stream water right filings. There's no way to prevent the status or the current conditions of our streams and rivers in Oregon from getting worse if we can't, protect what we have now. And a great way to do that is through new in-stream water rights filings, which of course ODFW and Park Service can apply for. Unfortunately, we see a lot of opposition locally to in-stream water rights filings, which would, with a 2026 priority date, it's not going to hurt any existing water users, but it would at least provide a baseline so that things don't get even worse than they already are. So that's one example, and I understand that it's a thorny situation, but that's one example where we have the tool to at least stop the bleeding, but we're not implementing it as effectively as we could. Similarly, with the management of in-stream water rights that do exist, legally they're equivalent, but we don't see them being treated as such by managers, and we need to do something about that. So those are a couple of examples, and I don't want to go too far down any rabbit holes, but just really want to emphasize we need to firm up our foundation before we can build for the future, and the water management is a great example where we can make some strides.
Thank you. What other barriers might you offer up? Kelly, Troy, Steve? Go ahead, Kelly.
Thanks. I just want to follow up on something that Anton mentioned. I feel very similarly as far as the water situation in the state of Oregon goes. I think folks have heard me talk about this for a couple of years now. I think that we do need to have, I like the term having a better foundation with what's going on. And I think the state is getting there with combining all the information that we've had regarding water and all the work that we've been doing on water since really honestly 2019. And putting that into the integrated water resources strategy. I think that is meant to be kind of our baseline document. But I also know that there are other endeavors happening with water, I believe including ODFW working on in-stream water priorities. And I think these are all really important pieces to the puzzle to laying a good foundation and knowing what we know now, because I think without having the information about what's going on with water in our state now, really with anything, it's very hard to plan for management of that into the future if we're unsure of what's going on right now. And so I would just echo that, especially related to water. I think that's definitely a priority for our tribe moving forward. I think another barrier to managing for resilience right now is kind of something that I touched on a little bit in my opening remarks, and that is the funding piece of things and where the priorities for the funding are going. And I'm not just talking at the state level, I'm talking at the federal level as well. It's very specific funding for very specific species. And I think that can make it difficult for us to manage for resilience right now with some of those other keystone species that don't get the funding. And so I think we just need to kind of acknowledge the funding piece of things. I'd also like to acknowledge the capacity piece of things. At Cow Creek, we're a pretty small natural resources shop and lands and resources shop. I know other tribes are bigger, but the other thing that I know we run into, and not just with tribes, but with other organizations and with state agencies, is capacity, the capacity to get the work done. a lot of times we know what needs to be done, but we're either lacking the funding piece or we're lacking the capacity to have someone to make that their main focus all the time. And so those are a couple of the bigger, more kind of, I would say, logistical barriers that we're facing.
I would agree with the others. I think that there's a lot of things that could be done, and there's a lot of us out there that would like to do them, but we're bound to the regulations and laws in place, and then the funding sources as well. I think maybe just to give you an example, the Klamath Tribes Reservation is largely on the Fremont Wainema National Forest, so the Forest Service manages those lands. And as we know, recently there was a legal action, and one of their multiple categorical exclusion NEPA planning efforts was sued against, and they're not able to use that anymore. And so sitting down with the Forest Service, we asked, well, what are you going to use now? And so they're going to start using like categorical exclusions that allow for linear field breaks, and which means, going in and doing treatments along roads, potentially 1,000 feet off those roads. And that meant to be for safety and mainly in the case of having to address a wildfire. And in reality, what they're doing is they're using it for linear timber sales along roads and couching it in fire resilience. It's just not the place you want to put those features. Those roads are of course, getting equipment in there is important. However, the landscape has natural barriers to fire on it, but we've neglected them for so long because there's not a monetary gain to do treatments in them. So we have coming from my place, where I am now, the Fremont Wainema was formerly considered a meadow wetland complex instead of a forest. And those meadows were drained and wetlands were drained. And so those were the features on the landscape that wouldn't have allowed fire to burn across it the way it does now. So, policies, regulations, and laws in place with good intent are being used in a manner that isn't getting the outcome that we need. We need to have that more holistic view of it. And, I guess from our perspective, we think that you should be treating for larger forested areas for resilience and not just along roads. And that would have a greater impact on wildfires as they burn through areas. We're definitely in a situation where our laws and rules and then legacy actions on the landscape are impeding our ability to improve some of these things. And the federal government overpromised, and now people are taking more than the land can respond to. And so, I think separating people from the land and having this idea of ownership of the land and dominion of it is a problem, because while a majority of us want to do the right thing, it only takes one that has control over it to do whatever it is they're going to do with it, and it affects everything else. So those legacy kind of history issues are really prevalent and really having that great effect on water and health of the system, and capacity, of course, as well. Where can you find the money? So again, looking at the Forest Service perspective, they can get funding for activities that aren't good for the landscape, but because it's funded and because it's already approved, they're going to do that and meet targets. So we're being driven in this economic manner, and we're not looking at the whole of the economics. And what is the value of a cow on the landscape? Well, we can say what that is, but can we say what the value of a deer on the landscape is? And we're not measuring everything holistically in a way that we have a good broad understanding of the effects that we're having with these regulations and the way that we interact with our landscapes.
Can I ask a follow-up question on this one, the barriers? Because each of you, as you were describing what resilience might mean for your tribe, there was a temporal aspect. I wonder if you want to speak at all to kind of temporal barriers for managing for resilience, whether that kind of plays into your thinking around this question.
I can take a stab at that. And I think, excellent points made. And I think with the example of linear fuel breaks, I mean, it addresses a symptom of the problem. The problem is the processes have been disturbed. So instead of having that wet meadow complex that used to characterize the Fremont Wainema, we've dried out those alpine meadows, and we've changed the fire behavior. We've changed the process. We've also changed the water storage capacity of the landscape so that those upland meadows don't hold water as long as they used to, if at all. And that exacerbates drought and water shortages down further in the system. So I think that's a great example of when you don't focus on a healthy process, this is what happens. And to your prompting question, Robin, to think about processes, you have to think on long temporal timeframes. It's not something you can just go in and, put in a fuel break. You have to think over, decades or longer to try to restore the process that used to exist to the extent we can. So I think that sort of process-based thinking really jibes with this notion of we have to think at longer temporal scales also. And I also blame Kelly for this one, but wanted to pick up and emphasize something that Kelly said about barriers to managing for resilience. If we don't have the monitoring and metering infrastructure in place, how can we manage things? It's kind of trite to say, but you can't manage what you don't measure. And water, again, is a great example of this. We don't have metering on how much water we use. We don't have adequate gauging networks across the state. Our understanding of groundwater resources is difficult because it is difficult, but we don't know. So how can we effectively manage this most precious of resources, water? So sorry, that's deviating from the time question, Robin, but I definitely wanted to emphasize Kelly's excellent point to that respect too. Thank you.
So, go ahead, Troy.
Can I also add something to that? I think the challenge is also, we're looking at these long time frames in management decisions, and funding cycles operate on a much shorter time scale and frame. So, there's a mismatch there that really has quite a large impact.
Just to add to that, Troy's point, actually, I was thinking about this too. One thing that I tell regarding the temporal aspect of things, I think in natural resources, I have this conversation with my staff a lot where we talk about the work that we do. I mean, sometimes it takes us 5 years to get a restoration project fully implemented, right? I mean, that is a long time scale, but we're actually not going to see the final results of a lot of the work that we do on the land, maybe not even within my lifetime, or for as long as I'm working for the tribe, right? And so we have to kind of think along those timescales and think about what we're doing now and kind of resetting things and what that's going to look like into the future, and have that now immediate time frame, but also looking at, how is this going to reset into the future, whatever our land management is, right? Whether that's forest management or stream restoration management, fisheries management. You know, we're looking at things into the future. And I think it is important for that temporal aspect for us to be able to monitor, right? Because we're not going to learn if we can't monitor what's happening and then be able to, once we have information, kind of adaptively change what we do, right, as we learn from it. And so I think those are also really important aspects of it. And I'm going to bring something up here as well, a barrier to managing for resilience. I did see on the attribute list earlier co-stewardship, and I really appreciate that because, you know, as tribes, we are managers of the lands as well. And I think sometimes I feel like recently folks have been listening more so and asking more questions, and I really appreciate that. But I think at times we still face the barrier of not being listened to fully when we suggest a management prescription that we feel will affect the lands into the future. And so I just think it's important to know that, because we've recently had some questions from people about, you know, well, do you really think this is going to work? Or do you really, you know, can you prove to me that this is going to work? Or we've made suggestions and folks have kind of dismissed them. And I just want to emphasize that tribes don't want to, I don't want to, my team doesn't want to suggest things that aren't going to work, because that's a waste of everyone's time and money, right? And so I think taking what tribes say seriously and really viewing us as co-managers is incredibly important into this conversation as we plan for anything into the future with the management of our lands.
Thank you for that. Debbie, Sarah, do you see other questions on this list that you'd love to make sure we get to?
I was actually hoping to suggest a friendly amendment to number 2. Debbie and I were also talking yesterday after the meeting about, I think for a lot of us in particular that come from a Western science background and kind of a settler mindset or heritage, maybe it's hard to imagine what a resilient place looks like. We can say, oh, well, it doesn't need thinning or it doesn't need restoration. Like, we really struggled to, and I think, I'm sorry, that's not just us. We recognized that in a lot of our conversations yesterday, that it was hard for folks to imagine and describe the kind of place that we're talking about, that's in good health, has functioning processes, shows climate resiliency. And so my friendly amendment to 2 is if our tribal government partners would be willing to share like a description of a place that resonates like that for you. And I think as we were talking yesterday, I thought about some of the work that John Day Basin Partnership has done that I've had a chance to see recently, or Anton and Troy, I had a chance to visit Meacham Creek up with folks from your team, where there's been a lot of restoration of function and process to, you know, over the course of decades, a lot of investment in sustained restoration with tribes and a number of implementation partners to be able to sort of get back to that. And I also struggle to describe it, that feeling of like, hey, this is the kind of place that really can handle a lot of shocks and change going forward and has that kind of healthy feeling that we like to see in here. So you can answer the, you know, boring version of the question too, if you want, of just what resilience is made of. But I just want to welcome folks to bring some place into the room and help us imagine what a place looks like that meets these attributes and gives us a vision for a success that we can start thinking about. No pressure.
So the question is, what resilience is made of?
Yeah, and what does it look like?
What does it look like?
How do you know what it is?
Sure. So, you know, going back to the bootleg fire that burned through the landscape I work in. You know, when that fire burned through, it probably did as much good as bad, because it really did burn, you know, large areas of lodgepole that should have been meadow, and there's really no way of getting into those areas and treating them effectively otherwise. And being sensitive, you know, at that time we weren't in a place to even implement cultural burning. And so, you know, the reality is the land remembers, and, you know, within the soil are the seeds. They've been dormant sometimes for over a century, you know, just with the impacts of suppressing fires on the landscape. And so we, at the Klamath Tribes, we actually signed a master stewardship agreement with the Forest Service in 2010, and more recently in 2023, a second one. And so that allowed us to plan and implement projects on the landscape. And so I don't know if any of you are aware of the photo I took of the Black Hills that was in that fire, but it really stands out in that on one side of a green area, it was untreated, and the fire came through there, and it was completely blackened and destroyed. And then on the other side, it was an area that we treated, which is thinning. But in the center was a place that had thinning and prescribed fire, and it survived the fire with little to no damage. In fact, the prescribed fire probably did more damage than the wildfire did in those areas. And so, you know, how we went about that was we took a lot of information off the land that was relevant from historical times, and we went out and identified trees in place where before any major changing disturbances happened, you know, with settlers coming into the area and grazing and then starting to log. And so we found out what the old trees were in those areas, and we mapped them, and we figured out their you know, the spatial complexity or their arrangement on the land, the size, the age and species. And we took that information along with fire studies that we did on the landscape that said fires burn through those areas at least every 12 and a half years, touching every inch of the land in that time frame. And we also did there was a BIA inventory that we replicated and identified the changes from when that happened. And that inventory was done in 1913. And so we took all that information and then we applied it back to a treatment on the landscape. So we knew how those trees were spatially arranged. We retained as many of the old trees as we could. And, you know, the timber sale itself ended up bringing in over $1 million in retained receipts. So it was definitely viable in terms of treating it and not having to come up with a bunch of money to subsidize it. But, you know, that is a place for me that, you know, having challenges and having been in a bad car accident and such, I healed myself in that place. And it was just me working on weekends and days and nights out in that place, just trying to reconnect to the landscape. And so it's a very significant place to me. It's a place of renewal for me. And so it was very exciting to see when the fire came through. And I said, I saw some imagery and I thought that maybe it survived, and I was told I was a fool, but it certainly did. And so, you know, that was a real example of resilience to me, but, you know, it needed a hand. And so we did it together as partners with the Forest Service, and then our partners with the Nature Conservancy and others. And so, you know, it really stands out, and it really is the number one thing in my mind, that if we, you know, have the right intent and we're able to implement that intent, we have a great outcome. But I would also say that there's areas nearby that were treated slightly differently, that didn't necessarily use the same principles that we used in our treatments. but it got harvested and then had prescribed fire and it survived as well. So again, it's that question of like, what was the purpose of removing fire from the landscape, and what effect does that had? And it's the greatest effect in those areas that are fire dependent that we've ever seen. So that's an example of a place.
I saw your hand up earlier, Kelly.
Yes. So I just need to say something to Steve here to bring this full circle. We were actually in a climate adaptation planning meeting, I think a couple weeks ago, and I referenced that photo from the bootleg fire that I think you showed it at the Government to Government Summit a couple of years ago. And I referenced that photo, and it is one of the examples that I use to talk about resiliency and getting fire back on the landscape and the importance of cultural burning. And so, Steve, I just wanted you to know that has really resonated with me. And I think that I think it tells an incredible story. I mean, just that image alone, where it's like this, it's burned black trees, and then there's this little island of green where, it survived, and I think it's just, that's really powerful. So I just want to thank you for that, because I haven't had a chance to tell you that. For me, a description of a place that resonates with me as resilient is there's a place called the Huckleberry Special Interest Area. It's up on the Rogue Umpqua Divide, and it is a really significant place to our tribe, and it's a pretty significant place to me as well. We worked with the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest, and are currently working with the Umpqua National Forest as well, to do replanting of huckleberry after the fires of 2017 and 2018 went through the SIA. And this is this is a great story of resilience and collaboration to me, because the Forest Service had gone out and collected some huckleberry seeds prior to the fires happening. And then the fires came through, and they contacted us and said, would you be interested in working on this project with us to do some replanting and some propagation? And so we were able to propagate over 11,000 huckleberry plants, working with the Forest Service at their Dorena facility, and then go out on the landscape and plant them. And when we went out, we had folks from the tribe, we had tribal elders, we had tribal youth, we had tribal staff, we had members of the Forest Service, we had members of local organizations as well with us, from the Understory Initiative and the Rogue Native Plant Partnership. And we all went out and we planted these plants. And it was especially meaningful for me because I was able to bring one of my daughters out with me and explain to her the meaning of this place to our people, one, and two, the relationship of reciprocity that we have with our lands, and that it is our job to help the lands when the land needs it, because the lands and these species take care of us. And so we have to take care of them. And that area, to me, is a place that is resilient. We've done some monitoring since doing the planting, and the plants that we did put in the ground are doing well. They're thriving. The area looks good. In some places, the fires did a great underburn. In other places, it was pretty scorched earth, so those areas are a little harder to recover. But just this last year, when we went up for our annual Huckleberry gathering, we were noticing how good the plants were doing, but also how much fireweed there was up there this year compared to past years, and how other plants are looking up in the area after the fires, you know, not just the huckleberries. And that's kind of my ultimate example for a place that's resilient, that's had wildfire go through it. Again, good and bad, but also somewhere that we were able to go back out and have that reciprocal relationship and help the lands and help a culturally significant species reestablish. And so when I think of resilient lands and a place that resonates, that's it. For me, it's the resilience is being able to get out there, reconnecting people to the lands as well, and helping those species recover. So.
Thank you, Kelly. Anton?
Thanks, Robin. I think Kelly and Steve have given some great examples of what a place that looks resilient might be, and that resonates with them. So I won't add on to that. But what I have been thinking and considering this question and listening to all this is that I think it behooves us to go back and really underscore the importance of functioning processes. And it reminds me of my Aldo Leopold long ago in The Intelligent Tinker. The intelligent tinker doesn't discard anything they don't understand because it might play a critical role. We just don't realize what that role might be yet. So I think that should very much apply when we're considering how we try to manage for resilient landscapes. We need to take a holistic approach and try to ensure that, you know, we protect everything that we can to the extent possible. Our historic in the last 150 years sort of focus on commodity outputs or discrete outputs from ecosystems really deviates from that. So if we're managing lands within the state enterprise to produce a particular game species or a particular fish, you know, we don't know the damage that we're doing to that ecosystem as a whole. So I think it's really at our peril if we don't take that broader vision when we approach management. You know, we can't be dewatering streams to flood artificial marshes for ducks or to maximize grazing production on a state wildlife management area. We might not know what we're doing by dewatering that stream, but we're definitely doing something. And we have to get away from that approach and take a more holistic vision. So at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I think it really goes back to when we think about defining resilience, we have to think about defining it in terms of healthy, functional systems, you know, broadly. And I think it's answer to question 2 just really hits back on that need to take a process approach when we're thinking about resilience. Thanks.
Kelly?
So I wanted to bring up, sorry, I'm trying to find it now. I have way too many windows open. The email from Sarah that came out last night. I just wanted to call out with question number 1. I know we're trying to move on and we have limited time here, but I wanted to thank you all for the addition on question number 1. And how does the foundational connection of nature to lifeways need to show up in how resilience attributes are articulated?
Thanks for noting that, Kelly. I think I shortened that when I moved it from the conversation we had yesterday to the email to the slide. So folks may remember the conversation we had yesterday around questions for tribal staff. And the part that Kelly just read was a question, a longer set version of this set of questions that I sent to our tribal staff contacts last night. So yeah, thanks Kelly for flagging that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I'd love to keep that in here if we can, because I think this is something that is incredibly foundational to what we do with resilience right now, and gets back to what I was talking about as far as the relationship of reciprocity that we have with the lands and the connection of our lifeways and resilience attributes and how we do management on the lands for resilience now. That also really ties into kind of the process-based ecosystem functionality that Anton has been talking about as well. Because when we were out replanting the huckleberries, we were noting the other native plants. How's the Oregon grape doing out here after the fires? Noticing all the fireweed a few years later. We're talking about, my daughter is being taught how to harvest bear grass properly so that it actually helps the plant and doesn't hurt the plant, and it comes back stronger. So I think that this relationship of nature and cultural lifeways is really important to our conversation about resilience into the future and how we manage for a resilient system. So I just wanted to flag that for everyone, that I'd like to keep that in there, and I thought it was a great addition to number 1. So.
Excellent. Well, I think we might have the ability to hang for a little bit longer before we take a break. So maybe another question or two, and then we'll break and see where we're going next. Really appreciate the conversation that's happening right now. So I'm looking at Debbie and Sarah to see if there are the tribes, if there are other priority questions that you want to explore from this list, or anything that's not on this list that you'd like to engage on right now.
Were you asking us or were you asking them? Yeah, we were going to ask them anyway. Take a question.
I would just like to add that, resilient systems includes people. The part of our ego that, I guess we're not looking at here, because we're all trying to be collaborative and but each one of us here is committed to what we're doing and thinking temporally, and longevity, right? Having the same or similar people to carry these concepts through and ensure that we're delivering this information in a good way to the right people, I think is important. And so that interconnectedness of all of us and just the recognition that, just being tribal doesn't make us necessarily unique, because we're all humans and we all, have similar ways of thinking and desires. And so it's more so that it's a cultural difference, but still, that is not a barrier in my opinion, especially when people show interest in each other's cultures and in the way that the state has done, I think, with the tribes, and, has greatly improved recently and has been a wonderful partner. So it is all of us. And the more we separate ourselves, the more issues I think we're going to have. And so just respecting our cultures and ways of thinking, and, we're all going to end up on the same page, because it's, we all have similar intent and want to see a more healthy landscape and future for all of us.
I'd love to just pile on and underscore those points. That notion of reciprocity is just so fundamental here. So often in Western constructs, nature and the human world have been separate, and obviously it's been to our great detriment. We have to get away from that. The health of the human community is inextricably bound to the health of the natural community. Fortunately, I think climate change is a great example of that, and all the smoky summers we now have and those impacts on human health. So we have to see them as one and the same and see that our good as people depends on the good and health of the natural landscape. So just, yeah, at the risk of piling on, wanted to underscore those excellent points.
Just pointing out that this theme around reciprocity, I can see it being built into the framework that we're talking through too. And we're also recognizing in these conversations, there's a challenge question there. There's a bit of a disconnect. So any advice the tribes might have about how the agencies, the state might be able to kind of close that gap a little bit and build in to their management programs and otherwise even funding investments, how can that sort of emerge and show up more clearly? I'll tease one out. Kelly, you talked about co-stewardship. There's other things I think really good advice you can offer to the state around how they might build into their programming investments and management actions, that connection, that reciprocity, that dialogue that's happening between people, landscapes, and water.
Sure. So I mean, I don't know that I have really specific advice on exactly how to do this. However, I do think it is a recognition, and what keeps going through my head was something that my dad told me when I was young. And that is that, like, hunters and fishermen and the folks that recreate out on the landscape are kind of at their core, whether you would use, this term in the traditional sense or not, conservationists, right? Because they care about what's happening on the landscape. And I think if there's a way to kind of bring that notion in and recognize it, similar to what Steve and Anton were saying, is just that people are a part of the landscape, right? And so how do we recognize that and then bring that in to help us all, as Steve mentioned, work more collectively together, right? As opposed to being, on an extreme one side or an extreme on the other. I think the $1 million question right now in a lot of realms is just how do we come together to work more collaboratively and collectively to have a better outcome. And so it's not necessarily something that's really easy to do, but I think finding that common ground that I think a lot of us in natural resources, no matter if you're one side or the other, about things kind of have and can find. And I think building from that platform and recognizing people and bringing people into it is going to be helpful. I don't know if what I just said was helpful, but
I see some nods in the room.
Kelly, as you were describing that, I was thinking about the work that we're doing together. Kelly serves on the OWEB board, and Mark Webb is also on a committee that's been working on potential changes to our land acquisitions program under our lottery funding. And I mean, OWEB is in some senses like the simplest natural resource agency the state has, and then we just give money out. And so, you know, it's sometimes we can be an easier example to work from. But part of what this committee that Kelly and Mark and others have been part of is working on is we have a constitutional mandate to do these land and water acquisitions in a way that primarily supports fish and wildlife habitat. That's what we're supposed to be funding as fish and wildlife habitat. And historically, I think just because it's a pretty old program and a pretty old funding source, the view that we've taken on access and recreation and even working lands uses for those, you know, conservation easements or fee title acquisitions has been, well, okay, we can do some of that, but let's make sure that we minimize the human impact of the fish and wildlife habitat values. And so, Kelly, I feel like that's been kind of an example of what you've been bringing in and others to those conversations as well. We're looking for a framework, and I think maybe this starts to move us in that direction that allows us to think about how humans and nature interact differently, because we know that there's a point at which infrastructure and frequent access and use, and humans are not always the most responsible recreators in natural environments. There is a point at which that access can, you know, undermine fish and wildlife habitat values, but we haven't really had that sort of intellectual framework to help us think about the positive aspect of the interaction between humans and nature as it kind of plays out in that program. So I hope that was a decent example of what you were describing, Kelly. I think it describes some of the work that we've been doing in that committee recently.
Yeah. Thanks, Sarah. I think that's a great example. And I can expand a little bit on some of the conversations that we've had. I think for, you know, like, for example, for Cow Creek, when we're looking at connecting folks to their lands and looking at that relationship of reciprocity and getting people out on the landscapes, part of it is that when we have folks that are on the landscape, that are out, that are gathering, they are actually taking care of the plants by doing the pruning and the harvesting. And so it's beneficial for the ecosystem to have folks there and to be a part of it. And yes, I acknowledge there are times when, you know, we can love our natural resources to death being out there and may not be the best caretakers of things. I've certainly come upon that. I think we all have. But I do think, you know, this other frame of getting people back on the landscape to have this relationship of reciprocity, tribal or not, right? To be caretakers of the land, to be engaged with it, and to be a part of the management of the landscape is really important. So that's, yeah, that was a great example, Sarah. Thank you.
Anton.
Thanks, Robin. And thinking about this, this notion of trying to better kind of harmonize human and natural communities, it strikes me that maybe the principal tenets are pretty easy, and then implementing them is next to impossible. An example, which is always encouraging to realize, but I think a great example is maybe, you know, we do a lot of work on floodplain restoration. Floodplains are very important to aquatic ecosystems and salmon, which the tribes are very important to the tribes. But in order to accomplish floodplain restoration, you need to, you know, restore the hydrology of the systems and restore the systems themselves. And so what that looks like is making sure there's water in stream. So it gets us back to our in-stream water rights issue and how difficult that has been just from the standpoint of political will and being able to get new in-stream water rights to stem the bleeding and try to transfer old in-stream water rights that actually restore flows. It's very difficult from a political standpoint, but I think what needs to be done is pretty straightforward. We need to stem the bleeding and try to restore the system. The second sort of tenet in that floodplain restoration example is setting ourselves up for success in the future. What does that look like? Well, it means trying to prevent future development in the floodplain that will be inevitably at risk of catastrophic floods. It'll further exacerbate the problems we already see with floodplains by simplifying and cutting them off and undermining those natural processes as it is. So then we very much get into that land use component. Well, it's very hard to do. We all know that we're in the throes of a housing shortage. We have affordability issues when it comes to housing. And so it's very hard to try to change land use patterns to prevent floodplain development, but that's a huge part of it. So I don't know. I'm not feeling really inspired. I think what we need to do is pretty easy, and that's, stem the bleeding, restore the processes, and set ourselves up for success in the future. But when you think about how we actually do that, it looks like a pretty wicked problem. But I think that's a good example from the floodplain restoration standpoint. We probably see similar things when you start thinking about wildland urban interface and wildfire regimes, and some of the same issues arise. But in contemplating this right now, it sort of strikes me as that's in large part the crux of the challenges that we're facing, at least in a lot of the work that we're doing.
Steve, do you want to add to this conversation?
Sure. Yeah, so I guess the reciprocal relationship is so I guess I'm always struggling when we talk about things ecologically and trying to understand them fundamentally. My mind always goes to human decisions, right? Again, we're the ones making the decisions. We're the ones damaging these things or treating them in a way that we're talking about restoration. We haven't been a country that long to where we need restoration, but here we still continue, right? And just those things like putting chemicals on the landscape. And so coming from the tribal perspective and thinking about the relationship being interdependent and a kinship with the ecosystem, is this something you would do to your family? Right. And I think that, that's a good guide. And that's where, tribes have ceremonies and we address those things a lot of times before, for example, if this meeting was in a tribal setting, we would have started with a prayer and an effort to come together and see each other first, and then start addressing the problems, because we know it's all interrelated. We're all interrelated. And so, that relationship, when it's considered in terms of tending the environment, is also another interesting place where, things have changed over time, and we've gotten bigger and moved faster, and it's really starting to push out the people that don't have the resources or are unable to donate to their politician to get favor in order to be the one that's doing the work that gets the profit. And now we have communities that were once vibrant and some of them are starting to fail, and there isn't work in those places, and here it goes right down the road of substance abuse and legal issues and those types of things. And if we all had an opportunity to find meaning and to understand that kinship with our environment, I think things would be quite a bit different. But somehow the society just keeps getting bigger and going faster, and everything's an emergency and we got to do it right now. And that's not always true. Sometimes it is, but having that longer term vision of if you take something, you give back at the same time, because it is your kin, and it's important in that way, because the land needs us, but we need it more than it needs us. Although, you know, the landscape was tended to for millennia, and so we just do it in a different way. So you also, when it comes to the tribal perspective, we bring in spirituality, you know, and that has a huge impact too. Thinking we always need something to point to that's bigger than ourselves, and you know, so I think that spirituality in whatever way, you know, folks understand that for themselves is important. But when we're doing these things out on the landscape, we need to recognize it as something more than just a resource to extract. And we need to give back at the same time. And I think that's something we could all do together.
Thank you. I'm going to look at you, Bobby, to see, do we want to wrap this portion up with our final question, or do you want to take a break and spend a little more time?
We actually have a next step slide to kind of wrap up this section. I think we were going to take a break after this and kind of start reconnecting with the.
You have time to choose your own adventure a little bit. So we can take a break and come back and do next steps. And if the tribes have any kind of final requests or instructions to this group as they go into the afternoon, we have time to do that. Or we could just do it really quickly now and take a break and move on. Your choice.
Debbie's nodding vigorously.
Yeah, well,
do you have an opinion, Debbie?
Maybe we ask the folks online.
Yeah.
Would you like to?
Are you tired of us?
Are you able to stay? I think the question is first, are Anton and Kelly and Trey, are you able to stay with us for a little longer if we take a break?
If you still want me.
We do. So I would recommend we do take a 10-minute break, and we'll come back and sort of do some concluding with questions and some next steps. So thank you so much for this really rich dialogue so far. And for those online, we'll be back starting up again at 10:40. Really appreciating the lively dialogue that's happening in the room here. But welcome back. We just want to start our transition. Okay. All right. So settling back in, the agencies just wanted to take a moment to talk about next steps, and then ask the tribes if you have questions for them about that. Go ahead, Sarah.
This is one of those slides that I changed after Debbie got this morning, so I'm going to start with it. But I just wanted to mention, we were talking towards the end of the day yesterday about we have different tribal staff sort of joining different parts of this 3-day meeting sequence in different roles. And I just want to take a moment to reflect that and appreciate the time that different folks are putting in, and know that you guys have a lot of competing priorities. I know Umatilla is preparing for a big meeting, and there are a lot of things going on. So both to note, we welcome participation throughout the meeting. Day one was content experts and including traditional ecological knowledge, being able to sort of help us craft that big vision. Today has been so far focused on tribal input and feedback, and then we'll start digging deeper and deeper into this attributes conversation. Tomorrow we'll be focused on sort of bringing in some additional state agency partners and trying to think about what implementation of this looks like. So that will be another good opportunity for us in our kind of shoulder to shoulder co-implementation role. To continue to think about this to whatever extent folks are able to join. And we just recognize this meeting was on fairly short notice, and a number of tribes weren't able to be with us here today. And so we did want to note, so one of the outcomes that we envision from this 3-day workshop is kind of a first draft document. So there's still a lot of time and space for iteration around that sort of first crack at defining these attributes and laying them out in a usable form. That's a product that for Debbie and I eventually goes to the governor's office. And I say eventually, but in fact, it's very quickly. And so we'll continue to iteratively manage that, I think, across months and years probably, which will create a lot of opportunity for co-creation and continued feedback. We do have, so when we get to that first draft document, we'll share that out for general distribution. We'll also share it as we normally do directly with tribal governments in our government capacity. We also have, it's really hard to face all directions at the same time. If we could get a rotating platform for the afternoon, that would work great. We also have, I just wanted to mention a couple of other existing tables coming up in April. I think we both have a state and tribal water policy table meeting where I think we can hold some time to continue this conversation with anyone that's able to make it there from tribal government staff. And the state tribal natural resource work group meeting that I think would have normally been in February and is in April, where that's more of a staff to staff conversation between the state and tribes, will also hold a fair amount of time. And we'll ask someone from the governor's office to come and share some perspectives there as well about the original intent of the EO. So we knew that this was going to be a push to get folks here. Really appreciate you making time. And we have some kind of additional milestones before we get to anything like a final product to send on to the governor here. So appreciate it. So with that, I think we just wanted to check in with Steve, Anton, Kelly, Troy, and ask if you have any questions for Debbie and I, or if you have any direction for the room, especially if you're not able to join us for the rest of the workshop, that we should be thinking about as we move forward, and then we'll wrap up. Segment. I'll put down the mic so that you don't have to grab it from you.
I guess I just have a process question. I apologize. I came back a little bit late. I appreciate you letting us know that this is going to come up in some other meetings that I'm planning on attending here in the near future. So that's helpful. But also, is there a specific time frame that we're looking at for completing something? Are there any deadlines that you all are trying to meet?
We were asked to develop a draft that would go to the governor's office at the end of March. And so that's been the sort of terrifyingly aspirational timeline that we have been facing Debbie's and my stress level about up until this point. I think realistically, we always talked about that as an iterative product. And we do also want to have, after an initial draft document, as I said, opportunity for both government to government and general public feedback. And so in my mind, if we have a pretty solid fork on this by Memorial Day, we'll be doing pretty well. And if that means that it's a pretty rough first draft that goes to the governor's office in March, I feel like Debbie and I might survive that. But that's honestly, we've been kind of dancing that line for a while. What do you think, Debbie?
Yeah, I think that that's seems like that would kind of thread the needle between the urgency that we're sensing from our leaders, but also just recognizing that we need to have time, to kind of put some of these drafts out there and have people give us their thoughts. So that's how we're trying to thread it. Does that answer your question, Kelly?
It did, yeah. That's a very short time frame. Thank you for that. And then is it helpful? I can actually stay on until noon today. I cleared the morning for this. Is that helpful for me to continue on for the next hour, or?
It's definitely helpful to have you stick with us, Kelly. I think how you balance that with your other priorities is up to you, but it would be great to have you here if you can do it.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions for us, or just thoughts that you could kind of provide for our group as we continue the work this afternoon?
Well, again, at risk of stating the same thing over and over again, I only do so because it's so important. I encourage the group to think about the importance of making sure we're building upon a firm foundation and just really prioritizing that we are implementing the current laws, policies, tools, and incentives that we have to protect our natural resources and create resilient landscapes and communities, just to make sure that we are right now implementing those to the best of our ability. And unfortunately, I'm afraid that we aren't. So just going forward, I would encourage this group to make that a priority of this whole effort. Yes, we need to, of course, build on that for the future, but we also need to shore up the current foundation. And that's not just for resilient landscapes. I think it's for durable, resilient outcomes. We need to ensure that the things we're investing in are following applicable laws, whether that's existing water law or cultural resource protection, environmental standards, land use. We need to make sure that the investments we're making are true to those laws on the books as well. So just, again, sorry for being a broken record, but it's so incredibly important that we're building upon a firm foundation. So just encourage that to be front of mind as we move forward. Thanks.
Don, this is Debbie. I just want to say thank you for making that point so well today, because, honestly, as we went into this, we've been so focused about kind of landscape scale challenges from climate and shocks to the system, and thinking about that as the challenge that we're solving to. And for me, your comments about, hey, we've got other stuff that's going to create barriers or challenges to be successful. And we need to acknowledge that and think about how we're going to address those. So you really kind of level set me on that aspect. So I really appreciate it.
I'll just throw something. A question I often get is how are folks supposed to consult with tribes, and how do you get us at the table? And I think that we're a sovereign government. We should be operating at the highest of levels, but we just don't have the capacity to do so. And so it really is a matter of capacity. We're all a little bit different in terms of our funding sources, and whether we have enough funding, or are we spending our time writing grants, and a lot of it is about a land base. Do you have a land base that does bring in base funding, and a lot of the tribes don't. And so if I had a recommendation to improve the relationship between the state and tribes, I would recommend that the state consider funding a position at each tribe that is dedicated to working with the state. You guys, from my perspective, have been wonderful partners lately, and we really do want to work with you and work a lot more closely. But we're limited by our ability to, we're having to choose which conference or workshop or grant we're writing any given day. So that would be tremendously helpful, and it could be co-funded and working part-time at each place, to where it's really bringing things together for the tribes, and they're not having to seek out the information when they have the time to address it, and we have someone there that's able to help with that.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else I'll ask one more time if there's anything else that our tribal partners want to offer into the room, into the space for the whole group to consider? What questions do you want them to explore? Anything that you want to make sure they don't miss? I think we're tracking a number of the pieces that you have elevated for the group today. But if there's anything that maybe has gone unspoken that you feel is worth putting in the room, advice or questions that you might have for this group as they endeavor with you to continue on in this work together.
Nothing more to add at this time, except just a great thanks for all the thoughtful attention to this issue and the engagement of the tribes. It's greatly appreciated. We look forward to continuing to work closely going forward.
All right, so I think we will transition now. Bobby's going to take over and set us up for the next conversations. So thank you again
It's
for
been an
this
honor.
Thank
great
you
dialogue.
all.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Robin. Will you help me rotate the slides back to that original diagram that we created yesterday? So Steve, again, my thanks, and Anton and Troy and Kelly, my thanks too. We're really glad you're here, and that conversation was great. Debbie and Sarah, thank you for hosting it. Well, if you'll forgive us, I think now we're going to invite the rest of the group together to process some of what we heard in real time. So that might not be particularly delicate, but we're just going to go for it if that's all right. But I think there is, if you looked at the kind of the 6 attributes that you all defined yesterday, I'm going to offer some reflections in the spirit of I hope you challenge me back, and let's start to think about what we just heard this morning and how we might adjust some of this framework. I have the advantage though of Alexa drew me a diagram that I'm looking at here.
Interpretive dance, Bobby.
I'm just gonna describe it. I'm not gonna do that to you, but we could do that later. But we heard ecological processes as being really important. And so, like, if you think of diversity, connectivity, capacity, and capacity to adapt, and then kind of that idea of healthy communities and healthy people, that we put a new attribute right in the center of that, that's ecological function. So we had kind of functioning ecosystems as an attribute kind of coming into the meeting. We talked about whether we should reframe that as complexity. Then we talked about how ecological processes might fit into, diversity, complexity, diversity, connectivity, adaptation. But whether it makes sense to just go ahead and just pop a new one right back in the middle, focused on ecological processes. So think about that. And then this other one that, Sarah, I think you described as kind of having the big hug around all of them, around stewardship. A lot of the conversation I was hearing around reciprocity and access and having people on and with the landscape seem to fit into a similar kind of idea. And so kind of around the outside of all of them, the idea of that connection between people and land, whether it's people on the land, with the land, making decisions about the land, having a firm foundation of laws and institutions governing the land, collaboration about what it looks like to the land. So basically reframing that outside hug one, really leaning into the concepts of reciprocity and access, and adding a new one on ecological processes in the middle. Let me stop there. Are people seeing that in their head without me drawing it on a piece of paper? We could do that too. Lisa, and if you all remember to use the mics, that would be awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, I was seeing that, and I actually am thinking about because of how central that conversation about functional, healthy ecosystem processes is, as well as people, that kind of putting both of those jointly in the outer circle is what I was envisioning in some way. And so I wanted to spend some time later, excuse me, drawing that out.
I'll come back to my that's where Alexa put process. So like, for folks who are on Zoom, I just put a sticky note on the projection right in the middle. So process is in the middle, and then that outer ring is kind of where access and reciprocity would be. But Lisa, you said something a little different, that the ecological processes might be on the outside.
Yeah, I think, and I want to spend some more time thinking about this and seeing it, but part of this is just how do you center it, right? Does it hold everything, or is it in the center? And maybe that's splitting hairs at some point and people can see it differently and it means the same thing. But for me, I do feel like when we talked about whether functional ecosystem processes should be another attribute that like is another slice of the pie or something. I do feel like it's more central and could actually hold everything, and people being in that holding. To me, they're connected so much that I'd like to see what that could look like on the outer ring. But I'm not opposed to having it in the center either. I think we're both kind of getting at the same foundational part that I was hearing from the staff from the tribes today.
Mark, and then Pete and Andy.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about reciprocity yet, but I was thinking the ecological processes around the outside as well, although I don't know that it matters, but I think that sense of really driving everything on the outside.
Okay. The reason I think, and Alexa, you can jump in here, but the ecological processes were in the center, as those are that's the hydrology, the soil health, the other pieces, the sustain and steward access reciprocity are things where humans are making decisions and acting and being actors anyway. Pete and then Andy. And then
maybe a question back for Steve or Anton or Kelly or Troy as well. I like the concept. I really like the concept. Our group yesterday talked a lot about the importance of process in these systems. I guess I'm wondering, is ecological process an inclusive enough term to capture cultural practices that are also inherently tied to some of those processes or a part of those processes in these systems that are really essential? I know, Kelly, you spoke to this to some degree too, with the fact that some of the harvesting and whatnot is actually is in its own right a process that is essential to those systems. So just a question.
Yeah. I don't know, Steve, Anton, Kelly, Troy, do you want to respond to that directly? And I apologize, I'm going to open up the viewpoint so I can see the queue here a little bit. But Steve, do you want to respond first?
Sure, thanks. Good question, Pete. I think it is. I think it's good. Just given that tribal people worked within the processes, so it should be captured within those processes itself.
Great. Andy, go for it. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I guess when I think about process, I'm actually thinking a lot about the space and capacity one is one I've been thinking a lot about, because the way that it's phrased now, I feel a little bit like it's just restating what resilience is. Like in some way, like it's just kind of like reframing the premise of this whole exercise. And I'm curious if it is actually like trying to capture process, structure, function more than like kind of just restating, like, is it trying to put those things there? And is that where that's nesting instead of the middle, or is that really like a separate thing? It reads to me as like what is that capturing other than space and capacity to be resilient, right? It's just,
yeah.
So
Robin, can you forward just a few to the piece? Debbie, this is where we fall into traps when we shorthand a sentence, yeah. I think, right? So keep going forward till you see tables, Robin. Yeah, keep going. One more. Yeah, right there. And then if we can minimize the video. So Andy, these are the indicators that we were hearing yesterday that we lumped under this one.
I do want to say too, though, Andy, that had we had 3 hours between the end of the workshop and dinner last night, we probably would have sat and talked about that the whole time, and it might have like landed us in a fight or something. Like it's really hard to say. It feels like we need a space to talk about specifically sort of space for flood, active fire management, stuff that doesn't really fit well in another category. And maybe that is just a process category, but we went around in some circles over that between 5 and 6 last night.
Because to me, these are the things we want to be resilient from. And so we're resilient from them because we have diversity, because we have connectivity, because we have process, right? So I think that's more like, and yeah, so to me, this is stating like we want to be resilient from these things, but what makes us resilient, landscapes resilient to these things, is diversity, is connectivity, I guess. And maybe I'm missing something, but I don't want to belabor that point. And I will also just say I get where everything nests, sort of like, is it around the circle, in the circle? I do start to worry a little bit about how that sets up hierarchy around future interpretation of these. So like, is that going to set up a process where as long as we have the thing that's enveloping everything else, like we feel okay, and like the things in the middle don't matter as much? I do want to be, geometry can reflect choices in advance. So
totally. And when we get into the part of this is all new to everybody. So part of what we want to do before lunch is process it a little bit together, and then we can do kind of the working lunch, like, are these the right words? Is the structure the right thing? Are the indicators right? All that kind of stuff. So I think I had Heather, and then Debbie, and Alexa, and then Josh, and then Kirsten, or Kirsten and Josh.
It's clear that the tribal conversation gave us nothing to think about. We all want to say something now. I really appreciate the inputs, and I heard two things that I just want to reflect back. One did sound to me very much like what the last comment was about, that a lot of the functions that we had in other lists yesterday fall under that space and capacity title now. So those do feel like they're trying to hold the same space. So where that ends up landing, I would encourage us not to create an additional category to have space and capacity and ecological functioning. A lot of those seem to me to be trying to capture specific functions like fire resilience, floodplain connectivity, drought resilience, in-stream flows that I heard today as ecological functions that are important. So I don't care if it goes into the middle, but my point is just, I think that those are very overlapping. And so if we can revisit what we had under that category with a lens of ecological functioning, I think we'll have a lot of the same thinking. Where it goes in a final diagram, I'm not making a statement about. I would just encourage us not to create an additional category before we return and see if we were really talking about the same things.
Andy, how consistent is that with what you were offering?
yeah, whether I mean, I think
Can you grab the
it's-
mic? Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, whether it, man, that sounded loud.
You spooked a couple people.
Sorry. I think, yeah, whether it's creating or setting, like nesting properly, I think it's mostly aligned. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
So.
Thank you.
Sorry, I had one other
mhm.
point I wanted to share back, which is just the outside part, the sustained stewardship. A lot of what I heard was access and activities that improve ecosystems. And that does feel to me like a very surrounding idea, very similar to some of the conversations we had yesterday. So I just support us continuing to think concretely about what we mean in that outer circle and how it reflects reciprocity ideas, you know, in language that the state can digest.
Can you say that one more time? Access and what?
I find it access and activities that improve ecosystems, which I just think builds a little on some of Kelly's really clear points. Like we can have access to do all kinds of things. And a lot of what tribes are doing are activities that improve the ecosystem, right? So they don't just need access, they need bandwidth and support to do the activities that will improve ecological processes, system function, resilience. And other people can do those activities, right? And so if the priority is emphasizing access and the ability to do the activities that improve the ecosystem, we're going to have resilient lands and waters.
And Mark, did I skip over you? Did you say what you wanted to say earlier?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, great. Debbie.
I want to kind of keep going on this access because actually the phrase that you just offered helps address kind of one of the things that I was gonna, I mean, I do struggle with the word access versus being connected and access to provide reciprocity versus access, you know, like Kelly said, you know, we have loved our natural resources to death in a lot of places in Oregon. And so I feel like access needs some explanation rather than just a word. Otherwise, for me, I have some negative connotations to it.
And access is the subject of active policy debates.
Yeah.
It
So
has a particular meaning,
And
both
so-
directly and connotation wise. Yeah.
So again, I hear the intent, and I just hope that there's some words we can put around it that make it, clear versus the active policy debates.
Alexa. Oh, Anton, did you want to jump in on that one directly?
Yeah, if it's all right, just quick, fully underscore that point. Access is very much a loaded term. So if we do end up using that, we certainly want to define it very carefully. I also might advocate for finding a different term that is less so politically charged. But yes, great point, and just wanted to emphasize that. Thanks.
Thanks, Anton. Alexa?
Yeah, I think we went around and around yesterday with sentences, and the challenge with a diagram like this is oversimplifying something that's incredibly complex, right? So this will not be anywhere near perfect or illustrative, but I find it helpful as just like a way of visualizing things and a different way of communicating concepts. So at the risk of overcomplicating it, I do think that there's, what we're talking about with the access and the activities, there's also, those are kind of arrows pointing into those inner circles, right? The space and capacity to handle disturbance is an activity like prescribed burns, right? There's, yesterday we talked a lot about working lands. So there's some stewardship there that feeds into sustaining livelihoods, right? That there's the outer hug feeds into those inner quadrants that then feeds to the kind of core of resilience, whether that's, function or space and capacity to handle disturbance, whether that's in the middle or not. But I think that the ring has an action associated with it.
Well, thank you. Josh and then Kirsten.
Okay. Yeah, on the space and capacity to handle disturbance, some of the ways today and yesterday I've heard disturbance framed as a bad thing, as something to be resisted. And so something I'll reiterate that I said in our group yesterday is disturbance in a lot of cases is the building block of a functioning, healthy, diverse, connected ecosystem. Mosaics in forests, for example, mosaics of age classes and structure are often a result of or guided by disturbance. Vegetation killed by fire is a key building mechanism for soil over time if those processes are allowed to function. Certainly, a loss of trees and erosion in an appropriate manner is a key building block of salmonid habitat and natural filtration of water for drinking purposes. If I want drinking water, I want a place that has had disturbance.
Because I went to Kasah.
So, the framing of disturbance as something to be resisted or avoided is how we ended up, often through use of force, removing cultural burning from the landscape. That's how we ended up with over 100 years of fire suppression that now, combined with climate change, is causing us to have very problematic, catastrophic disturbances. And so I would say that space and capacity to handle disturbance, I would probably view it as we want to incorporate disturbance into the ecological processes piece because it's a key part of it. But it's a release of current forms that then reorganize, and then there's a new growth phase, and that is often a key part of fertility, of soil health and depth, of building salmonid habitat, regenerating forage, all these things, and disturbance is part of it. So I see a fire in my hunting grounds in Southwest Washington in 2020, and I see that, I'm like, oh no, my forest burned, and then I go back, or the forest I love burned, and then I go back 5 years later, and it's like, oh, this place is lousy with forage now.
Well, Josh, I wonder, sorry to interrupt, but I wonder if the the kind of making sure we're looking at this in combination with ecological processes and making
Yeah.
sure that the framing is working so that disturbance is not a bad thing, but disturbance is a process that we want to make
Disturbance
space
is a
for.
process. And and disturbance appropriately, like I think the bootleg fire is an amazing example where there's this disturbance that is the agent of the disturbance was human beings with saws and fire. And the result of that was more resilience, right? Like I'm an agent of disturbance in my orchard when I go in there with saws and loppers and I cut stuff out. But the result is those trees have more space, more light, more air, less struggle internally, and then it's more fertile.
Cool.
And so I want to really work on that. If I can get one thing through this,
we've got a working lunch. I'm gonna put you right in that group.
Yeah,
Make sure you
so
sit right in that
if
group.
there's one thing that I can get through this, it's like let's
Yeah.
reframe how we're thinking about our relationship with land and plants and animals to one that's reciprocal.
Totally.
Which that's my like
I
whole
think
European
you have a lot of people in the room
tradition.
thinking the same thing.
Yeah, but the other is disturbance. Like disturbance can be very bad, very harsh, but also how we react to disturbance, either by like avoidance or by like, man, it's a good opportunity to go do some more extraction. You know, those are unhealthy relationships to disturbance. I want to like think about part of climate resiliency is a healthy relationship to disturbance that is beyond the next 5 years time frame.
Gotcha. Yeah. So be thinking about what those indicators would be. How would you know that when you see it? So Kirsten and Pete.
Thank you, Bobby, and the tribal representatives for making time and leadership for making that happen today. That's really impactful. And I'm reflecting on something that Anton, first of all, I do love function in the center. I feel like there's a life of the cell lesson here. One of my first classes in college was like, how magical is that? So to me, something very precious and important is the building block in the middle really appeals to me, but I trust the designers and the graphic designers to work it. But sort of like equity at the center is a moment, but function at the center appeals to me. But reflecting on something Anton had shared about holistically, I'm going to confess that I've been struck since I've seen this really elegant diagram, and thank you for the late night workers on that. There are hours of thinking that just went on in there and couldn't afford it if we had to pay for all of that. But I've been struck with the physical landscapes, and I'll confess that it's probably because I'm trained for what it's worth as a comprehensive land use planner, and the diverse species and habitats and physical landscapes gets me thinking of like a town versus a commercial parking lot versus a channelized stream. So I'm probably ahead of schedule, and we might be workshopping this over lunch, et cetera, but I would definitely love to see, and my team back at DLCD, including the coastal program representatives on the call, would love to offer structural complexity back in there, or at least lose physical. So I can't pay attention to everything at the same time. So if you don't mind, Robin, flipping back to the quadrant, because we certainly can live with any number of outcomes here, but reflecting on what Anton had shared with us is to think holistically. And when structural complexity gives something very different from across physical landscapes. So it may be a note for later, but I just wanted to share that. Thank you for the time.
Yeah, thanks, Kirsten. And I think as we start workshopping some of this, like I think it was like this group in particular talked quite a bit about complexity and where that went back to, and I know as you all were working on a sentence yesterday evening, the physical landscapes was trying to get plain language on geophysical features or settings. So at any rate, that's what the intent was, is to try and get to some plain language on like the rocks that form natural barriers to catastrophic fire, or those kinds of physical features. Pete, I think I skipped over you. Yes, yeah. Sorry, I lost track of my cue, so you guys can just Whichever one feels good.
I think I can be relatively quick. I just wanted to offer up a framework that is popping into my head. There was a paper by Katie Wolstein out of OSU, Wolstein L24, I think, that was essentially about its own Venn diagram. So maybe now we're three-dimensional, layering another Venn diagram on top of this diagram, but it is essentially around a framework for conservation readiness. And I think, if I remember correctly, the three circles are sort of they call it ecological importance. I think a lot of what we're talking about here in terms of identifying attributes of resilient landscapes, one could argue could fall in that bucket. The second was sort of social capacity. And I think that a lot of the conversation around it's relevant for tribes. It's relevant for any community that shows up and wants to work on these systems and have this sort of access and whatever term we're going to use, not access, the ability to help steward these landscapes. And then the third is sort of the conducive management conditions, and that's sort of the legal and policy framework. I think Anton's comments about being on solid foundation with the existing law and policy and how we apply it fits in that category. Also, just sort of the legal ability to do stewardship work on the land. So just offer it up there. It could be a relevant place to gather ideas.
Everybody's mostly said everything that I was going to bring up, but I just wanted to build on the Venn diagram, like Kelly's comment from the get-go about this is a great figure. How about a Venn diagram? Seems like it could be interesting if we tried to turn this into more of a Venn diagram. But I'm really interested in this reciprocity concept. Yesterday in some of our conversations, we were talking quite a bit about ecosystem services, but that's like functionally and fundamentally different from reciprocity. And so how do we bring that more two-dimensional aspect of relationship with place and commitment to work in place to this kind of a structural framework, particularly when all of us have recognized the crucial importance of connecting people to places. So just wanted to put that out there as something for, I think, all of us to think about, that reciprocity is just so fundamentally different from ecosystem services, or that one-dimensional relationship that most folks have with nature. Thanks.
Yeah. I was just going to turn the question back to you. Do you have any particular ideas on how to articulate that two-directional relationship in terms of indicators, or how would you know it's working the way it should?
Yeah, I was just thinking about something that Sarah said yesterday in our small group about how, connecting people to wildlife is one of the mission elements for ODF&W. And it seems to me that there could be ways when we talk about the conservation actions that we're taking and the restoration actions that we're taking, that we could also quantify, some of the other aspects of relationship that people have with hunting and fishing and some of these things, the taking away as well as the putting back part of that. So we can talk about some of the extraction pieces within the context of the restoration pieces, possibly in some sort of way to frame that out.
I was going to change the topic, so if folks want to continue along that line, then cut me off. Okay. I wanted to take us back to the process thing, and not actually, Robin, can we go back to the full sentence version of this? Just to, I think that there's actually it's in today's.
It's the other way.
It's in today's. It's okay. But what I wanted to ask was, I think it's the process part that we brought in here, I think is really helpful. I think it helps clarify some of the things we were really struggling with last night about the space and capacity for disturbances. And we did actually pick up the absorb, adapt, and recover language that I think came up at the green table maybe yesterday. But I'm kind of, maybe this is just a question for Anton, and I don't want to put him on the spot, but I will. You talked about processes, and then you talked about water quantity pretty specifically. And it actually came up at the yellow table yesterday where water quality lives in this set of attributes. And I'm kind of curious whether adding process as a high level attribute gives us a kind of a gestalt here that has space for water quantity and quality issues, if that's going to be able to play out in indicators, because I think a lot of what we're describing here will be very difficult to achieve without water quantity and quality. So I don't want to disappear that in the process.
Sarah, stop me if this confuses things before Anton jumps in. But the group had talked about like re-exploring that space and capacity for systems to absorb and kind of reframing that a little bit more around healthy functioning ecological processes. So
that, I think that might help. And I just don't want to lose that as we talk about processes more broadly, because fire and flood and drought are really different from, related to, but really different as processes than water quality and quantity, which are created by processes. They're relevant to processes, but they're not exactly the same.
they're not, yeah.
I appreciate that comment. Oh, I thought it might kind of put you on the spot too, actually.
Anton, did you want to speak to that? Like, if we were going to find a way to incorporate ecological processes, but in particular, make sure that we're not losing water quality and quantity, where you would have that, and then maybe Annette, I'll put you on the spot next.
Well, beyond just complete agreement, I'm not sure what you're looking for from me. You know, when we think about, again, go back to my example of floodplain restoration, you know, we can't just put sticks in a stream to try to create more habitat for salmon, because there has to be water that inundates those sticks. And then we start thinking about, well, what is the water quality? If there's not enough water and they're inundating those sticks, then the water quality is no good because it's too warm or has too high of some sort of contaminant. So, I mean, the short answer is, yeah, you need it all. You need the whole process to be working. You can't just focus on those discrete components. So, just editorial comment. I don't know if you're looking for something more from me. I'm happy to try if so, but.
I was just looking for all the answers, Anton, but we'll continue to muddle.
I disappoint again. I'm sorry.
Thank you. And I actually, truth and disclosure, went over and asked Bobby whether or not the description of landscapes was adequate to include water. And so maybe it's about, I like the way aquatic systems are reflected in the first bullet around connectivity. Maybe it's including that elsewhere, because I feel like that sort of brings, when I hear landscapes, I'm not sure that I'm thinking aquatic systems. And aquatic systems could reflect both water quantity and water quality.
Yeah, that's helpful. I mean, if folks feel like there's room for it, then I think as we work on edits, we can, and as we work on indicators today, we can start playing around with that. And I feel like we kind of have to go through the whole exercise with a land lens and a water lens and maybe check as we work through each one. But there was definitely some 10 p.m. wordsmithing going on in here that might have resulted in some unexpected tendencies.
So Kelly, Steve, Troy, Anton, as you're listening to kind of how the whole group is kind of processing what they heard from you all this morning, and kind of some of the direction or options of how this attribute framework may adjust. If they're feeling like you're getting listened to, is it feeling like we're headed in the right spot? Anything to watch out for, any requests you have back to this group? Because I'm going to frame up what we might do over our working lunch next.
I would say that I definitely feel listened to, and I appreciate that very much. I don't think I have anything to add at this point.
Bobby, can I ask a question before you transition? A few of us were talking over the break, and I wanted to make sure we had an opportunity to ask this question before maybe our tribal partners have to jump. Especially as we're going to this next step is we're going to start thinking about indicators. which eventually lead you to thinking about what you measure and the story that you tell about whether you're getting closer to resiliency or not. And that is that, and I think Kelly mentioned this earlier, a lot of what we're doing here takes decades or generations to materialize in terms of outcomes. And so how do you demonstrate success in the short term, particularly for funders, when really your outcomes take a long time to surface? And I think we wanted to just ask you all that question because you tend to take that longer view.
Steve, you feel good taking that one first?
He's not grabbing at the microphone.
he's not, but he nodded most vigorously.
No, that's a great question. And I don't know if I have an answer to that, but I think that coming from the tribal perspective, that's where we're very intentional in what we do. And I think we're ceremonial as well. And that brings us together in a way that we can have a common understanding of where this is going and that short-term impacts could be necessary for long-term gain. But it's just as difficult, I think, in a tribal setting too. And I certainly face that. And, to be perfectly honest, my job's been on the line multiple times in making decisions that are long-term, but short-term look pretty crummy. So it's very difficult, but it's, again, these problems are human in nature. So it's our perception of it. And right. And so if we're able to come together and recognize it is the question.
Anton and Kelly, and then I see Kevin.
Thanks, Bobby. Yeah, excellent question. One that we grapple with all the time. And I think the way that we try to grapple with that best is sort of reframing what success looks like. It's very hard to quantify how many salmon we're going to produce by a restoration project, but we can identify the processes that have been lost by simplification of a system and what we're trying to restore and how that impacts and enhances the productivity of the aquatic ecosystem and eventually salmon. But again, it's going away from that focus on outputs from an ecosystem to actually restoring the function of the system itself. That can be a less than satisfying answer to some funding entities, so it takes a lot of education, but I think that's really the way that we try to grapple with that. It's just really reframing what we're trying to do here. We're trying to restore these systems. We're not trying to increase salmon output. That's a happy byproduct of what we're doing, but we just really have to reframe, these efforts to restoring processes to the extent we can. That's how we've tried to tackle it anyway.
I would say just to add to that, I think a lot, I tell my team that it's kind of, we're helping to reset the system, right, from impacts that it's had. But when you reset an entire system, you don't see those results immediately. So I think it's important to have the monitoring in place so we can see how what we're doing is working or maybe not working, right? But also just sort of, I feel like in natural resources, you sort of just have to settle into that uncomfortable space of, we're going to do this, but we're not going to necessarily see the benefits immediately. But we know that this is what we need to do because it can't continue on the current trajectory, right? So it's a little bit of just having the mindset of understanding that this is going to take a while. And I think if anyone has been a part of a restoration project, you know, there's the project inception, there's the idea portion of it, there's the securing of funding portion of it, there's the contracting portion of it, there's the design phase of the project. Then you get to implementation, what potentially, you know, years later. And then when implementation's happening, you talk to your staff that are doing the project. And if anyone's been out to a restoration project while it's in progress, it sort of looks like a bomb went off, right? And the staff is just like, no, this is not what it should look like. This is not. And you have to consistently, you know, remind them, yes, it looks bad right now, but we're resetting, and that's going to take time. And then we have to let the processes come in and refine what we've done. We have to let the river come in and do what it's going to do to help reset that. And that's going to take time. And we can't always measure exactly when that's going to happen. Or like Anton said, how many fish we're going to get returning. And I think we can see that. And sometimes we think it's going to take a lot longer for a system to reset and to see a result. And sometimes it doesn't. I mean, I could cite some of the dam removal work that's been done in the Pacific Northwest and how we thought, oh, this is going to take years for fish to swim back up into these streams. And it's like a year later, we've got fish recolonizing, right? So it is really this uncomfortable space and settling into it and leaning into it of not knowing exactly when we're going to see those results, but knowing that it needs to be done.
I would add, maybe as an example, the Klamath Tribe's former chairman, Don Gentry, who is a staff member of mine. He is one of the best examples of tribal communication, and he speaks in stories. And so he would have a story about, you know, pick what you want, you know, how did that pin get blue ink? And somehow he relates it to a deer hunting story. Right. I mean, you know, and so I think that those legends and myths and stories are meant to lead people to the reality of things do take time, and they will improve as long as we tend to them as they go.
Yeah, so it's almost thinking like, what stories do we want to be able to tell using this information? So I saw Heather and then Mike and then Annette.
So in my experience, it's very common in conservation practice to use activities as a short-term indicator of progress while you are waiting for long-term system change to happen. And I have seen in other cases, activities associated with Indigenous action as part of monitoring programs that make space for that near-term tracking and credit giving and comfort building while ecological function changes. And I'm curious how that kind of an approach would land here, both from the tribal perspective and the state perspective. So very concretely, there's an example from Ontario, Canada, with First Nations there and the state, the provincial government, where they included in a carbon credit program indicators like number of ceremonies happening on the land, number of people in intergenerational activity on the land, number of, or just presence of activities that recover ecological process happening on the land and in the water. So there's our concrete, measurable, near-term activities that are different activities than we usually measure in an environment context, but we very often measure activities in an environment context to indicate short-term progress. So I'm curious how introducing those kinds of indicators would land here, if that provides some progress in this space or not.
This is just a question for how would the state respond to that question? And how would the tribes respond to that question?
Well, I'll start with the state, and I am a funder as a state agency, and so I think actually, I want to tell a little bit of a Umatilla story, which is not directly related, I think, but maybe connects back to that, which is that Director Quimps, Anton and Troy's boss, I had a chance to visit with him and their staff, Meacham Creek in that basin that was one of the first OWEB investments in restoration in our history with lottery dollars. It's one of the oldest projects that we have. And so we went, I guess my understanding is CTUIR has taken a basically river mile by river mile approach to comprehensively do the kind of structural, functional, and then sort of vegetative reset that Kelly was kind of describing. And so we went to some of the earliest parts, and I was like, okay, this is the resiliency moment. Like, this is about as good as it gets. And Director Quimps was pointing out that the understory, the floodplain reconnection had allowed the understory to redevelop to the point that he couldn't get in there for fly fishing anymore. And so this was like, oh, bummer, but actually it's reconnected successfully and it's doing its thing. And then they showed us two other areas, one where very intensive management had resulted in a very rapid response, relatively speaking, and another one where a smaller amount of money was available and a sort of low-tech restoration focus, and it was headed, you could tell it was headed the same direction, but it was taking a lot longer. And so that, I mean, it was a very generous educational opportunity for me, for us as a funder, to say, like, this is the end goal. It took us 25 years to get here from OWEB's first investment. This is the shorter, faster version. And that's very expensive. And this is the longer term vision. And just so you know, if you're investing in this kind of work, it's going to take you 10, 20, 30, 40 years to, and I don't actually plan to be in this job 40 years from now. So that's kind of a big commitment. So I think that is part of what I've been imagining as this conversation progresses. And then Heather, to your point, I think, we were talking yesterday about the durability of this work and like what makes agency implementation of this executive order stick beyond the tenure of normal executive orders or other work that might kind of come and go over time. And again, OWEB is a simpler agency than a lot, but because we have a pretty straightforward mission and mechanism, but we have kind of a DNA about how we make decisions that's nested in statute and rule, that we have evaluation criteria for our programs that sort of looks like what somebody was describing actually from the paper you mentioned, Pete. But we look at these different evaluation criteria to decide how to make funding investments. And everything else the agency does pretty much hinges on that. Like, it's pretty invisible from outside the agency unless you're a grantee and you're used to working, proposals to try to fit those evaluation criteria. And it's kind of sacrilegious for me to come here and say that we could potentially change those evaluation criteria to reflect this work. But that's also where my mind went with Heather's comment, is if we nested that kind of thinking in the decision criteria that we have in rule that drives the decisions that our agency makes every day, then I think we could go there. But that would be a really big step for us to be able to say, here are social factors that support our agency's mission that's in the Constitution, fish and wildlife habitat management and water quality and watershed enhancement. And to have this framework that says, and this is how nature interacts with humans, that's going to be sort of enshrined in the way that we do this work going forward. That's the sort of huge mechanistic shift that I think would be needed to get to a point where we could say, and a reasonable outcome for a grant is, this kind of, well, we do that kind of engagement. So anyway, sorry, I drifted towards the end there. Big question.
But isn't part of that, Sarah, let's pretend you were going to update your grant evaluation criteria. This group could help define enough of a framework that made the leap from attributes and indicators to evaluation criteria, that jump is not such a big jump, right?
I think so. And I think for every agency, getting it into the DNA of agency decision-making would be the thing that would make it lasting. And all we would need is that conceptual framework that we're working on today. And then 18 or so months of public rulemaking process.
Right. So I think that's the challenge that's issued to us as we start to think about everything we've been hearing today or thinking about in terms of conceptual terms or stories or what's actually been happening on the ground, how to high grade that enough so it's still specific, but that it can start translating into all the different places it needs to translate to. So I saw Annette, and then.
Can we hear from the tribe?
Oh, you want to? Yes, of course. Kelly, Anton, Steve. So just repeating the question is like, would a framework where near-term actions as short-term indicators be enough of a good proxy for while we're waiting for the long-term outcomes? Is that it? And
specifically things like ceremony or intergenerational exchange, like different kinds of activities that we don't usually count as conservation or environmental land well as progress.
Gotcha. So just to translate that onto a mic, would activities like ceremonial practice, intergenerational exchange of information, other activities that aren't normally part of grant processes, would that work as kind of short-term indicators for some of the long-term outcomes that might be coming? But for the folks online, feel free to go for it. Steve or Kelly, go for it.
I'll start. So in short, yes, I think, because we already use those as indicators of progress in the work that we're doing. So if we, for example, like with our Huckleberry Restoration Project, if we get tribal members out to help us with the monitoring, or we get tribal members out that are harvesting in the area and they check in on our plants and they give us feedback, or we have members that are out that are gathering, that are already practicing, the relationship of reciprocity out there in an area that we have done restoration work in, then we would count that as progress and an indicator of positive change. It's hard to report on those things and quantify them. But it's something that we do. I mean, we build into our restoration projects. Okay, if we're going to do a riparian restoration project and we're going to plant willows, then after planting, how many years afterwards can we get membership out here to harvest and make this, a gathering area for them, right? But it's less of something that, we track on a spreadsheet as an indicator, and more of something that is just a little more, I guess just foundational, and something that we would count as an indicator or a win that there's positive change happening. And sometimes when we translate those things to trying to be tracked on a spreadsheet or in that way, it doesn't always translate properly. Like if we conduct one ceremony in an area that we've restored or something, to us, that's huge, right? But then to report on that, like for a grant or something, and it's, conducted one ceremony, right? It doesn't necessarily seem like it's that big of a deal as it is to us. I had 2 people go out and gather in one of our restoration areas. Again, doesn't sound like that much, but it is. And so for me, in order to, it's like, how do you translate the magnitude of that from what a tribe feels how important it is to what like a granting agency might think is important. Is this making sense? Because you're sort of along for the ride with what's happening in my head right now. So
Kelly, I think it's making sense. I might just offer that it may not be that difficult to report. It just may be more difficult for the grantors to understand how the magnitude of that importance. And that's maybe the issue and where the work needs to happen, not necessarily. You can say one ceremony reported, and if you write a sentence that says, and that was enormous for us, done.
It's more of a qualitative metric, I think, at least in what we're doing. It's critically important, but it's not something you necessarily put a number on.
Sure. Steve, I don't know if you wanted to respond to that directly, but we're getting close on lunch. I did want to try and set us up for kind of what the working lunch might look like, but I don't know if you wanted to say something on that too.
Sure. I'll just, so yeah, I don't know how reliable of a metric it is, but it's the most measurable in terms of how I'm treated in the work I do. So are members able to go out in these places and be effective in whatever it is they're doing, first foods, medicines, hunting, fishing. And, again, a lot of them are very private, and we collect data, for example, on harvest of animals, and the tribal members won't give us reliable data because they don't want us to know where they got it. They don't want anybody else to know either. And so it makes it difficult and hard to measure, but certainly it does have a great effect and has an impact on things. So even in terms of, I guess, my bravery in trying to perform a treatment in a certain place may be based on a former treatment where people started to respond positively to it. So yeah, it is effective. It does have an effect, but it's very difficult to measure.
Yeah, and it sounds like there's agencies that have had some examples of where this has worked. So that as we go into after lunch, we can bring those kind of back into the conversation. And then Josh and Ned, I was gonna move us into thinking through framing up the working lunch. Is that okay? If there's something specific you need to say, feel free to grab a post-it and hand it up to Rob and I. We can try and bring it in if that's all right. Let me move forward with sharing the slides again if we're not. But kind of the plan, and I want to check this plan with you we'll grab lunch and then come back and kind of work through in some small groups on framing some of these things out. And I just want to see if the plan has changed since last night to this morning. So the idea was to go through each of the main attributes and kind of looking through each of the tables. So if you can forward to one of the connectivity table for me, Robin. Yeah, back one to the connectivity table. There you go. Perfect. That we would have a tabletop that would kind of work on each of these attributes. So we'd have a tabletop working on connectivity and ask, hey, is the sentence the way you want the sentence to be? What kind of issues would you want in the description for the attribute, and are the indicators complete? I don't want you all spending a ton of time wordsmithing. I think that could be painful. But instead thinking about, like, what do you want this sentence to communicate? What would you like this paragraph to communicate? And just kind of articulating, like, where did Kirsten go? But this idea around physical landscapes might mean something different to DLCD. So I need this sentence to communicate that. Right, so don't worry about the exact words, but just trying to record it. And then just checking the indicators to say, are there any others that we want to put on there? So for example, we talked about kind of being able to hold ceremony in landscape, kind of the bravery around a pre-existing action leading to the next action. The idea of reconnecting a floodplain, allowing riparian areas to access the seed bank or whatever. Kind of connect that. And then if you could forward over. So if we have a small group working on each one of these different kind of attributes and example indicators, actually go back one more, Robin. So this is the one that I think needs the most work. This is where you all need to kind of take a look back at the ecological processes and where there might have been indicators or things you talked about yesterday in the context of good disturbance, to think about how to reframe this one, whether ecological processes are its own thing, whether this can get reframed. And then if we could scroll forward just a little bit. One more. One of the things we were playing with is if it would be more useful kind of thinking about the connectivity indicators or the language in a potential use case. It's like if you were actually going to use the attributes around connectivity to design a new floodplain restoration program for the state of Oregon, how would these attributes help you prioritize where you wanted to work or evaluate what success would look like? Or if you wanted to update all of our various programs for supporting farms and forests to sustain habitat over a period of long drought or post-fire, how would you actually apply a connectivity set of attributes? So we put these there just in case it was useful to ground it in something a little bit more specific, but you don't need to go there. So let me pause there in terms of kind of what that plan, Sarah and Alexa and Sarah and Debbie, does that seem consistent with what we talked about trying to use the working lunch for? Anything you want to make sure we try and design the working lunch for to get you what you need by 3 o'clock?
Just say that, as we kind of work on the tables, I think kind of testing some language around the indicators can help to make sure that we're still tracking with each other on what the attribute is. So even if the attribute doesn't say it, but the indicator makes it clear that there's an element of redundancy. Like you don't have to say redundancy in that, but yes, an indicator would be that. So I just kind of be thinking about kind of how those two columns intersect.
Yeah, I think that would be a really helpful activity for the working lunch to ask people to start to think a little bit about what the indicators might be. And I would just say that, again, 10 p.m. group effort last night means that what's in that indicator column right now, it just give just a little bit of grace, I guess I would ask on that, and that not everything that's in there is actually an indicator. It's really a capture of the conversation from yesterday. And some of what's in there is just things that people were saying that maybe further define the attribute. So you're going to look at some things and be like, what is that? That is not an indicator. Feel free to say delete it, change it, cross it out. So.
And I think in that sense, like, don't get hung up on wordsmithing the indicators, like to Debbie's point. If you see the word or the concept there, make sure the concepts are captured on paper and that what does it need to communicate back?
Yeah, you can literally put, you should have something about water quality in here. Like that would be enough for us to run on for a while. Alexa, did you want to add anything to that? Are we on the same page? Okay, great.
Okay. How about for everybody else in the group? Does that sound like an okay plan for the afternoon? Feel productive? Anything that leaves us not doing before we hand these over to kind of the agencies and managers tomorrow to kind of apply that layer of practicality and doability? Okay. As I say those two words, that would be the one thing I would ask you to start thinking about when you start thinking about those indicators. As much as we don't want you wordsmithing, start thinking as like, oh yeah, Nature Conservancy totally has this data set on this kind of thing. Or yeah, Dogami totally has this access to this data set. Or ODA might say, oh, as it's phrased here, I don't know what to do with that, but if you phrased it just slightly this way, I can handle it. So I think start playing with some of that. Yeah.
Actually, you're bringing up a really good point, Bobby, that I wanted. So we're still going to get to metrics. Right. So can we have,
I don't think we're going to get to
not today, but eventually, and the metrics are going to be where we measure. So to what extent is the availability of data something that should inform our selection of indicators?
I think it's about time to start paying attention to that. But Sarah, you were the one kind of talking about the practicality from day one. I mean, the goal of this work is not to get all the way to metrics, but the availability of data and the measurability is probably something to start thinking about.
I would offer that I wouldn't let it be a hard sideboard, but it's a consideration. I think we want to know, I think it's a good gut check. Like, are there data available on that, either that the agencies hold or that partners hold? And so is it a realistic indicator? But I do think we also want to know what some of the aspirational indicators are, especially if they're truly the right thing that we should be measuring, because we can keep track of those aspirations and think about them as, future needs. I mean, I think that's channeling Chandra. I think she is curious to hear what's in the gap that could be a future ask.
Yeah, Andy?
Yeah, I was going to add the gap, understanding it more as a gap, because again, going back to one of the questions I had yesterday, which is how NGOs could start thinking about places to help where there are gaps or science needs, those that have science partners or the ability to grapple with some of those measurement gaps or things like that becomes opportunity, right? So.
Yeah, just sorry to kind of repeat some things, but I mentioned this yesterday after Sarah's comment, and at the time it might have felt like I was pushing back, but really that there may some of the results of some of this work may be that we identify that there are tools that maybe we don't have yet, but that we need them, or tools that we have that need refined. And so some of our investments as we do this work may be in the space of new modeling, technologies or methodologies, even if we don't have them now, or the data that they would produce now, like that could be part of this process that we invest in developing these new tools or these new mechanisms to measure things.
Cool. Okay, great. So it seems like the task at lunch is clear enough. I'm going to think out loud now with our facilitation team here, because we're going to be down a few facilitators and we're getting ready to go to 4 subgroups. So, I mean, like if we look at the groupings, at least on the slide at the tables that we had, so we know we've got 3 and you've got a 1 to 2. So I'm going to look at our agency friends. I may need to draft one person to help us facilitate, if that's okay.
I know a really skilled facilitator that I work closely with.
Are you drafting yourself? Because usually,
No,
I try and boomerang those types of volunteer things straight back and get me somebody. Okay. So if you can go, the next question is, are the tables we drafted, would that be useful if we got a couple printouts so that folks had access to that in the room? Okay, all right. So can we go back to the connectivity one, Robin? So probably what we'll do is we'll define a table per topic and then let you choose your own adventure. All right. And Aaron, are you willing to take the group online? Is that okay? Okay. And then, so I think I'm just going to assign the group online, and anybody as well. A few people are welcome to join with Aaron there, but tech-wise, we're just not going to be able to get a ton of people, like 2 people. But if I can give you the outer ring of reciprocity, access, stewardship, and the inner one around, it's not healthy communities, but whatever the other one related to people are. And then let's do connectivity at the back table. Liz, can I give you connectivity? And then I'll take, and then diversity. Can I give one of our agency friends diversity? And then I'll take the room to adapt / ecological processes. So those would be the tables. That sound good? So help me remember what I just said. So ecological processes, adaptation, diversity, and connectivity, people online. That sound good? All right.
Self-select which table they want to go to.
Self-select, and I may come and tap you on the shoulder if I get 100 people at one table. And then let me just, let's go ahead and take a quick break. I'm just spying for lunch and they may need like 5 more minutes. And then I need to check with Myrna and we'll get things printed out for you. So go take a stretch for 5 minutes and then I'll come find you when lunch is just about ready. So thank you all. And again, Steve, Kelly, Anton, thank you for joining us. You're welcome to stick around. We'd love to have you otherwise. Kelly, we know we had you till noon, so thank you.
I was just thinking about it.
Let's give them
like north of Kansas City. In our fire district. And so when we go out to the public for a live lift in 2024, they're like, oh yeah, because they have like.
This is where I'm going for the next month. Yeah, sorry about that, Aaron. That's my fault. And we'll go from there. Does that sound like what we're aiming to get ready for tomorrow? So for all of you that stuck with us these 2 days, we would love for you to be here with us tomorrow. What we're centering and the voices we're centering tomorrow may be a little bit different, but just quick show of hands, how many state agencies are here right now? Right? So yeah, Gorge Commission, you kind of count. Yeah, sort of. You can raise or lower your hand however you choose. Same thing. We can do the same as Oregon Consensus. We can lower our hands or raise them as we need to. But we would like everybody to be there. I think your perspectives over the last 2 days have been really valuable. All right. Any questions before we kind of start with report outs? Sarah, Debbie, Alexa, Sarah, any directions or hopes as we kind of try and finish out these attributes, descriptions, and indicators for today?
I hope it works.
Okay, cool. Since I'm holding the mic, I'm going to hand it to Andy first, because one of the questions that came up around ecological processes, is that going to be its own indicator with separate from kind of the ability to adapt to change, or should it be one? Andy's got an answer for us. We don't have to agree with him, but he's got an answer for us. There's a mic there. You can take this one if you want, Andy, up to you. And just checking audio online. Can you all hear us online okay? Like Kathy, others?
Yes.
All right, cool. Thank you. Thanks, Jesse.
All right. Well, I'll start at the top to answer the question. Yes, it should be, it's ecological process now. So it's its own thing. We did rewrite the sentence in light of that. So we now read, the space, time, and capacity for ecological processes to support, ecological processes and disturbance to support and reinforce ecological functions and outcomes. Something along those lines. And really the description, thinking a lot about the absorb, adapt, recover from short-term shocks and long-term stressors framework that we've seen other places. I think one of the concepts was sort of thinking about disturbance, not as like an own separate thing, but one of many processes, right? That like you might want to think about keeping functional. And then so we took other concepts from the original background document to include things like floodplains, fire, hydrology, soils. So I think if you look at like 6, I think it was maybe 7, some of those. And then we thought a lot about how planning, climate modeling, adaptive management fit into this as well, still as like an indicator, some way to incorporate that into this attribute. So, and there's a lot more up there. So that Bobby took great notes. Thanks, Bobby. Maybe have an answer.
Can you grab a mic in it? Sorry.
Do you consider the water cycle an ecological process? So relationship between groundwater, surface water?
Yeah, I think we would incorporate some of the cycles into this discussion. Carbon cycle was another one. We thought about it not just in terms of the cycle, but in terms of sequestration and stability. So, but yeah, and then we do have some language in the draft indicators around some like specific water pieces and things like that capture some of that.
Yeah, but Annette, I think on this one, if there is more specific language, do you want to take a look at and adjust or add to? I can do that on my own. Perfect.
Thanks, everyone. Unless there's more questions, I guess.
Yeah, anybody else from our group? Yeah.
When you said room for ecosystems, is that how you put it? To adapt or move?
Yeah,
Why would-
the space and time.
No, further down.
Space, time, and capacity. Do we say I don't room? Is it?
I can't. Sorry, I can't see it.
Yeah. Oh, room for ecosystems to migrate in response to climate change. Is
Yeah.
that-
Why? It sounds like you're in a house and you're moving to a different room. Why wouldn't you say ecosystem capacity to migrate? And it doesn't matter, but just didn't sound right.
I would say, from my perspective, that's fair. It could say that instead. I think it's just the notion that through climate change, like landscapes will there will be landscape vegetation migration, right? Yeah, right. So that is maybe a process in and of itself.
Okay.
So.
Sorry, everyone's waiting to who goes next. Sarah, you want to go next?
Okay, I think I'm going to take this for the small but mighty diversity table. We were half Sarah's. Let me see. I got to work from the screen, and I got to take my glasses on and off.
Yeah.
Oh, and it's on the connectivity page. Let me get over there. Yeah, I got it. Okay, so in terms of diversity, we took some effort to bring in some of the other concepts that were talked about yesterday, like complexity. We brought complexity into this one. Redundancy, we brought that into this one as well, and landed on an attribute that says something like diverse and complex. Oh, it's up there now. Thank you. The magic of the cloud. Diverse and complex habitats, species, landscapes, and aquatic systems that provide options for responding to change and disturbance. Thanks to Heather for sharing a great reference example from the Stockholm Resilience Institute. Really appreciate that. And we'll maybe that'll become part of the resources to share out. They talk about how diversity is kind of made up of three things. It's made up of variety, a balance of those resources, and then disparity. Like, is there difference between things? And so there's just some good grounding kind of quotes from that we'll likely draw from. We made an attempt at an attribute description that we are talking about diversity on a lot of different levels. Species assemblages, vegetation structure, geographies, that's what builds resilience into the system when disturbance strikes. So we did mark a question here. One of the things that the Stockholm example talks about is resilience in some of the human systems as well. So they talked about, diversity in the human system. So they talked about cultural diversity, diversity in governance systems. And so I guess we pose that as a question, is like, is there kind of a social piece to this that is worth including? And I don't think we're necessarily talking about like, diversity and yeah. Yeah, I don't think we're talking about that necessarily, but just like, how is the landscape supporting diverse human systems? And then we also took a stab at some of the indicators. So there could be a number of indicators related to species composition. So that could be, like the State Wildlife Action Plan has diversity metrics based on species richness that could be potentially useful. But there are others, like what is the extent of invasive species as a proportion of the landscape in a particular area? Or you could flip that and talk about it as extent of native species in a certain geography. You can also talk about diversity in terms of landscape patches. And I think there are
we refer to it as a nerdy landscape diversity metric, but there, you know, there's probably a lot of opportunity for us to think about landscape heterogeneity using remote sensing information. You could think about population trends for indicator species or functional groups in this category. You could think about vegetation, structural complexity, stream complexities, just spatial patterns and arrangement. We did have, you know, part of what you're trying to achieve here, part of why you want diversity is so that you can accommodate natural disturbances. But that's likely an indicator that's shared with our ecological process friends. So that might be one of those that is a twofer. I think that's, folks can read the rest of these, but I think that's about what we covered. Definitely don't think that all of these are possible right now in terms of what is being measured and tracked, but there are a lot of different ways you could go about identifying indicators for diversity.
Questions for the group working on diversity and complexity? Other thoughts, things missing? Yeah, Mark?
Just a comment about monitoring. I know the Forest Service, their CFLRT program, Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, has had a strong monitoring component. And at least in terms of the veg, I think there might be some pretty good metrics and indicators there just based on Forest Service work over the years.
Just adding to that, like remote sensing capabilities are becoming better and better every year, and which will, I think, help facilitate some of those monitoring efforts.
Cool. How about the connectivity group? Oh, sorry, Josh.
When talking about water, I'm gonna put in a plug for we've been kind of quantity centered. So that's when discussion on water, I want to include water quality, like having good water quality.
So with the connectivity group, we worked on the language for the attribute and description. We really wanted kind of a plain language approach for the attribute itself. So we settled on connectivity within and across land, sea, water, and sky. So making sure that we're not just capturing our terrestrial landscapes and our aquatic landscapes, but also flyways, organisms that are like having migratory movements in skies that may be affected by things like wind turbines and light pollution. And then in the description, acknowledging that connectivity has two major components. One is structural and one is functional. So structural connectivity is referring to the physical structure of the landscape or the seascape that can support movement potentially, but then the functional component is actually the successful movement of organisms and ecological processes. And also acknowledging the fact that that functional component is very closely aligned with ecological processes, functioning ecosystems. So there's definitely overlap there between those two attributes. We threw out a number of indicators. Most of these are pretty broad indicators that could be applied at a statewide scale rather than something that's a little bit more ecoregion specific. We didn't dive down into that much detail. Most of the indicators that we discussed are more on the structural side, so assessing the capacity of the landscape to support that structural connection. So that's things like stepping stones of habitat embedded in an urban matrix, connectivity across different climate gradients, which of course has significant overlap with the habitat diversity piece, like having those microclimates and that geophysical diversity and the complexity of habitats. We talked about ecotones in particular. So the fact that a lot of our anthropogenic dominated landscapes have very harsh edges, very linear edges. And then, maybe one indicator for improved connectivity could be a softening of those transitions between habitat types, persistent pathways to allow for daily, seasonal, annual, once in a lifetime movements for organisms. So lots and lots of things here for potential indicators for those structural connectivity piece. The functional piece is a little bit more difficult, and then we get into like tracking species movement across the landscape and tracking genetic diversity, and if there's genetic exchange between subpopulations, tracking nutrient availability, and transfer between different ecosystems. But yeah, I mean, mostly the significant overlap with the ecosystem function and diversity pieces, because again, we have to have the habitat complexity, the diversity of geophysical habitats to permit the connectivity that allows for the ecosystem function. It's all intertwined. It's all connected.
And we have water quality and quantity on there.
Okay, good. Just making sure. Nice. And Liz, I saw you pop into the sentence here. Did we get the sentence adjusted how you wanted it, how the group wanted it?
That's too small for me to read, but
I'll pop it up and read
we
it
have
out
it.
loud.
We have it written down here, and we have our description written down as well. So
Okay, that'd be perfect, because I think we're making some adjustments to the core sentences of the attributes, which is something I would very much like to carry into tomorrow before we leave, if possible. So connectivity across land, sea, water, and sky that allows for movement of organisms and ecological processes.
I think we ended the attribute itself at connectivity within land, sea, water, and sky. And then the description has a more detailed language about facilitation of movement of organisms with ecological processes and the difference between structural and functional connectivity.
Great. Folks feel pretty good about that? I mean, bonus points for simpler sentence. Yeah. Okay. Mark.
I appreciated that. Again, sorry to maybe talk about this, but on the Malheur, so given that there's not going to be additional funding likely to monitor populations and the like, one way that we help the Forest Service with their NEPA analysis and the planning and the like is having target historical range of variation, the sort of ecological processes there, and then tier those to the, for example, terrestrial species that are found on the Malheur. If you're implementing particular kinds of veg treatments that move the landscape back towards those ecological processes, there's a way in which you're actually indirectly monitoring for species because you're increasing that habitat. And it's just something to think about if you can't track populations or species per se. If again, you're targeting the ecological processes, and there'll be some additional steps you need to take, but that's one way we help the Forest Service address their wildlife habitat management obligations.
Great. Thanks, Mark. All right. Aaron, you want to bring us home with the last two, or your group want to bring us home?
Not me.
Can I read my writing from whatever, 20 feet? Yes. Okay. Oh, sure. I think I could do it. All right. So we had a couple of attributes, and I think we took part of the work, we described the two together, and then I think also established a separate set of, or talked about some of the indicators of each one. Oh, thank you. Okay. So I think we started, so the top one, which is capacity to sustain communities, livelihoods, and economies, is that far left one. We collapsed, I think, several of the examples into a more holistic indicator related to the natural resource-based economies, and then activities like hunting and fishing, and just that those are sustained. And then talked about access to first foods and ability to practice traditional life ways. We also, I think there was one of the group members wanted to make sure we captured that the environment within communities fosters human health. So just not limited to urban areas, certainly, but wherever that community is, that the environment lends itself to human health. Okay. I think help me out here, team, but I think we came up with one attribute description for the two attributes, and it is the starred one in the middle, which is people in nature or environment. We'll let folks wordsmith after the day today, but or land, people in lands and waters are resilient together. So we're both experiencing resiliency and in place-based relationships through place-based relationships. Moving down to the bottom attribute, we obviously came up with a lot of indicators there and just kind of worked through the list of examples, noting folks have ability for adaptive management. We wanted to make sure and capture, I think, some of the comments Anton had made this morning in terms of full implementation of natural resource laws, that there was a desire for state agencies to make decisions that aim to improve ecological processes and functions over time. And that I think that agencies feel empowered to do that. Let's see, that all levels of government collaboratively manage towards and for resilience. We discussed quite a bit, how do we recognize sovereignty, treaty rights, and then access to lifeways. So we've got that captured on the other one. And then the last three bullets that you see on the paper that Mark is holding really relate to the community-based relationships. So both community engagement that fosters that's inclusive in resilience planning, that this leads to strong community relationships and cohesion, and that there is strong social license for resilience actions, including some that maybe are traditionally tougher to accomplish or to have community support for. Any group members, anything else anyone would add? All right. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Steph, before you go too far, did you change any of the sentence, or did your group change any of the sentences on the left? With what?
People in nature are resilient together in a place-based relationship.
Did you like that word place-based relationship versus reciprocal relationships better? Welcoming, okay. All right, thank you.
We also thought it might be worth running by the tribal members.
Okay,
Well, just
great. Okay, thank you. Kristen?
Thank you. Can you center that chart again?
Yeah, this one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just can't see it, but I was looking to see if I know there's agriculture. Is there also forestry and grazing represented?
So we collapsed those into natural resource.
Resource-based. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we should maybe be clear that like the things we wrote on those papers are the only things. We've like deleted everything else. So those replace those lists.
Yeah. Yeah, and we'll get that caught up here in just a little bit. Kristen, does that answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm loving that land use one. Thank you, everyone.
And we did the same. We replaced what was there.
Yeah, we'll get caught up with that for sure. Okay. Just two of us cheated and used our computers. I know, I'm sorry, Aaron. Yeah, Andy, go for it.
I'm curious on the natural resource-based economy is sustained. Are you interpreting that as like sustained in a way that supports resilience, or just the continued existence of natural resource-based economies as they are and doing what they're doing?
So as a industry sympathetic individual, I would say.
Sorry, Mark. You know where I'm going. Thank you.
Sustained in terms of aligned with an ecologically informed approach. So Yeah, maybe not what we've done in the past, but certainly industry, ecologically informed practices.
All right. Any questions? Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Sorry, I had a general comment, like across all of them. I probably missed my opportunity, but I didn't know where it fit in.
Is it like a next steps or a process thing or like
No,
a structural?
No, it goes in.
Then
There's
go for
somewhere.
it.
It's just like a missing, like I didn't hear it or see it. So I don't know if it's missing. So I'm just throwing it out there. Okay. Two things. One, yesterday I heard something about the importance of below ground complexity and diversity, soil, that kind of stuff. Was that captured anywhere? I don't need an answer. I'm just throwing it out there.
Well, I think we can give you one both from we have soil building process as something in the ecological process piece, and I think the diversity folks have something too.
Yeah, we also mentioned it and we thought that was a good place to flag potential intersections with the natural and working lands process, that's like one place where our Venn diagram overlaps. Odo and Kathy, that we should sit down and really think where does that live and who's doing the primary work, and then we can refer one to the other.
Okay, and then this is somewhat related, but we've been talking, I feel more direct indicators, and I don't know, have we talked about carbon sequestration or carbon stores at all? Because I think when I think about climate change, we talk about, you know, the impacts of climate change and the underlying like causes. This is an opportunity for us to be building long-term resilience by building up those things, and it probably falls within ecological processes. And I don't know if you guys captured that. It's definitely cool. I missed it. Sorry, I'll be quiet.
Well, you only missed it because our notes spilled below the bottom of the slide. So like the nutrient process, soil building, carbon flux and stability was all there at the bottom. But Jason, you're wanting to say something.
No, you already captured it, but
Oh,
thank
sorry.
you. I appreciate someone called that out.
There you go.
Bobby, can I just plus one that just for a sec? Thank you, because I might have woken up in the middle of the night worrying about that. And then I reread the EO this morning because before I emailed Sarah and Kathy and all the directors and was like, why are we on the wrong track? So the way I read it, and I would appreciate confirmation. So because this is the EO is really focused on resiliency. And then when you get to page, because it's resiliency, and then we get to page 4 in prioritizing key lands and waters, and then it says agencies shall seek to maximize implementation of actions with co-benefits such as increased carbon sequestration and biodiversity. So I was like, okay, I'll wait for my moment in there. But I was really worried. I was like, wow, just reflecting on the major resiliency attributes that we came up with yesterday. I was like, shoot, we missed the ball in carbon sequestration, but I think it's supposed to be in co-benefits. Am I on the right track? Are we on the right track?
Also, there is a parallel effort going on led by Department of Energy and Jason Sauer and his team that is identifying metrics associated with carbon sequestration and natural climate solutions. So, and the EO speaks to the need for this process and that process to converge and be complementary. So that may be some of what you're getting at, and I don't know if you're familiar with that ongoing effort. Yep.
This is Jason Sauer. I will just add that I was a little quieter on the first day because resilient landscapes are landscapes that tend to sequester and protect and store more carbon. So I was just like, we're all on the right track here. And then today I just made sure that it was explicit in in my group. So.
And that was one thing that we talked about is for a lot of these issues may be implicitly covered by others. And my hope is that we be explicit they are embedded within, right? So if someone comes and asks, like, how did you all deal with carbon sequestration? it's here, it's embedded explicitly within habitat diversity structure, ecological processes, that if you have these kinds of resilient landscapes, you are going to get carbon sequestration rather than just implicitly believing it to be there. Because then we don't have the explanation when someone asks about it.
Yeah, so I just want to make sure, just because it comes up in litigation sometimes, the carbon sequestration capacity that we're targeting will be consistent with the ecological processes of the regions we're talking about, because right now you could grow a lot more trees on the Malheur and sequester a whole lot more carbon, and you're likely going to lose it in a wildfire. And so I just hope that the appropriate goal of carbon sequestration is tiered to the ecological processes that are appropriate on the landscape. Otherwise, it'd be pretty compromising.
Where's Pete?
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, Pete, did you want to say something about the back and forth we had a little bit on managing fuel loads to kind of this point of once we start getting to some of the indicators on these processes, that there are going to be differences?
Yes, I mean, we had a lively conversation about sort of managing fuel loads, and then also just reinforcing that the carbon sequestration and storage is also in some systems about making sure that that carbon is stored in stable forms, i.e. fire resistant structure, large fire resistant trees. So yes, to your point, I think we had that discussion, and it's probably important that it be carried forward into the elaboration and description of that particular indicator.
Great. I just want to check with some of our content experts that have been on the phone with us. So, you know, Kathy or Susan, others, anything we missed from today, or as you've been listening to the report outs you wanted to offer? Yeah, go ahead, Kathy.
It's super hard on the phone, but just to follow up on Pete's comment, I think you might avoid the use of flux, even though obviously every ecosystem has storage and flux, but maybe say something along the lines of stable net carbon or something. Stable is super important. I don't know. I defer to you, Jason, about whether flux makes sense, but and when we adopted the 2021 Natural and Working Lands proposal, we talked about the concept of kind of we want increasing net carbon, but recognizing that it needs to be appropriate to the to the setting, and tried to use the word net to get at, we're going to take some carbon away. Some of our management is going to reduce stored carbon, but long term, it's going to increase stored carbon. So I don't know if that conveys it very well, but that's all I'll add.
This is Jason Sauer. I don't have much to add to that. Maybe I can work on the specific wording before I head out today, just to make sure we're capturing some of that and consistent with the Natural Climate Solutions work and the inventory work. So,
yeah, that sounds great. And also, the way I captured in the notes was not one of the high level sentences. It's just a note too. So, yes, and if you need to get home and deal with it another day, we can do that too. All right. How are folks feeling about where we ended up? We've got 5 attributes. Was that? Did you hear from the online group? Well, Kathy.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry.
Oh. Yeah. Erin, per usual heroics, did both. Yeah. She managed hybrid off of her computer. So double kudos, Erin. How are folks feeling about kind of the 5 attributes that we've got? We've got a sentence for each of the 5 attributes. We've got some concepts around the descriptions. We've got indicators. In a lot of places, we simplified things. If not, we expanded on them in explicit ways. Anything we didn't cover, we need to make sure we get out there, and then before we kind of talk next steps? Yeah, you all worked hard. Please.
One of the pieces that, I touched on when we discussed the connectivity attribute was the interconnectedness between many of these attributes. And I know that that was captured in the initial handout. That kind of last bullet point there was talking about the interconnectedness. I assume there's a plan to discuss that in some aspect about how many of these overlap or how much these overlap in different ways. I mean, obviously there's going to be potential indicators or metrics that are shared between multiple attributes, but the attributes themselves also overlap.
I'm wondering, to make things easy for ourselves just for tomorrow's sake, we could just put a title that says like everything is interconnected. I mean, is that fair? Just to like for now, and then to your point of like, let's make that more explicit and figuring out the graphical orientation and what those arrows back and forth actually mean and like all that stuff. Is that okay?
I mean, I thought the Venn diagram idea was a great one. If we can figure out how to make that work.
Yeah. I'm just not promising to pull that off for tomorrow. But yes, there was a lot of interest in the Venn diagram.
Kelly will be so happy.
Well, if we can make Kelly happy, then we're halfway there. That's good.
I heard it needed to be 3D.
I'm gonna say no. I mean, it could be. You guys can do whatever you want, but the power of what you're starting to have now is it's so simple. It's got a lot of complexity underneath where you could go, but from a high level standpoint, like I can't remember more than 3 things, and this is 5. So we're getting there. Okay. Debbie, Sarah, kind of closing thoughts as we kind of go think about kind of appreciations for this group and kind of setting ourselves up for tomorrow with the agencies and where we want to go.
Debbie's first.
I really, honestly, I guess I'm usually an optimist, but I'm realizing that I didn't think it was going to be to this point by this point in the process. So just many, many thanks to all of you for kind of working through all of this. And I feel like we're on a really great trajectory for the next step and the conversation tomorrow for sure.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think we had a lot of faith coming into this that we could get pretty far, and I didn't think we would get any further than this in 3 days. And honestly, it was kind of scary as hell at one point yesterday afternoon. It was like, wait, is it going to work? Is it going to work? But I feel like this is where we wanted to get, and just, I mean, huge appreciation. And also, I just get really excited to kind of package this up and share it with a broader diversity of partners and be able to say, like, we put some smart people in a room and really squeezed them, out. And here's what we came up with, and then provide us with your thoughts on this. And how does this connect with your community? And how does this, help you think about the role of state agencies and how we work together and how we should guide our work? So I'm excited about the progress, and I'm also excited about that next phase of seeking broader input and knowing that this number and diversity of brains have been working on it for that first draft is super exciting.
I also want to compliment just kind of today, just listening to what our tribal sovereign staff had to say. And I feel like folks really internalized what they were hearing, and it made a difference in terms of what we ended up with today. And I really appreciate that.
So we'll see what else we can squeeze out of you tomorrow. I do think we'll probably have a visit back from Jeff Huntington and/or Chandra Ferrari tomorrow morning, so we can take that opportunity to show our work to the governor's office as well. And we've shared the list of questions to state agencies that we came up with yesterday with Jeff and Chandra, in case they would like to come and reflect on some of those, in addition to state agency staff in the room and directors being able to comment on those. So we are bringing back in those questions from yesterday to tomorrow's conversation as well. And then I think we hope to focus on, like, okay, we see the whole thing. What's next? What are our kind of hopes or fears or offers and asks for how we move this work forward? Something like that. We'll come up with discussion questions tonight.
Yeah, and on your, Debbie. on your way out, if you do have other questions or kind of hopes that the agencies cover tomorrow, and not just agencies, but land managers generally, feel free to come and grab me and give me that question right now. Just yes,
Bobby, I'm
Kirsten.
sorry, is there the questions for state agencies?
Can you
is there
grab just a
something we
mic
should-
just a little closer?
Is there something we should be thinking about overnight? I do plan to sleep through the night tonight, but is there like?
No, don't think about it. I mean, this group came up with at the end of day one, which was yesterday, I think, came up with a bunch of like, here are the things that we would like to ask state agencies. And I don't think that's something that we need all of the natural resource agencies participating tomorrow to answer. We'll try to kick some to the governor's office. We'll try to pick up a few that, that us two lead agencies can work on. But I don't want everybody to spend the night sorting through that. You need a fresh brain tomorrow. How does that sound to you, Sarah?
Sarah and Debbie will be nice to you, and they made sure that I will be nice to you. So otherwise, I would pop quiz the heck out of that. But the questions are here if you want to look at them on your way out.
Maybe this is a bit more of what you were referring to. We were chatting earlier, and in terms of what's going to happen tomorrow, one of the things I said I thought would be really valuable is if the state agencies, I'm really keen to hear from the state agencies, like what does forestry think of the conversation from the last 2 days? What does ag think of the conversation, and so on, DEQ. And we were talking about, hopes, fears, asks, and offers, just kind of like reflect back, like, what did you hear? What do you feel like is potentially really workable for your agency? What are you a little bit nervous about? And so I think to the extent you wanted to know that, to be able to think in advance about that, I would love it if we could have that opportunity for hearing from the agencies tomorrow.
And that was the design of the workshop. I don't know if folks noticed, but the tone did shift quite a bit this morning when we were kind of looking at the world through a different lens. Tomorrow too, we want to look at the world through a different kind of lens to see how this issue around how we understand, measure, and talk about resilience changes as we look at it through different lenses. I think Robin and I were talking a bit yesterday too of one of the most pleasant reflections and surprises that we had is both you all coming together as a community of people who care about resilience, and how there might not be that many spaces in Oregon for the resilience nerds to hang out and talk. So just to note that, like, that's something real. And so supporting you all over the next 10, 20, 37 generations, however long you're going to need to be in community with each other, you have that a little bit now. So think about how you can best support that, and if there's any way we can help support you in building that too. And then again, just giant thanks to kind of Myrna and Ivy and Nicole and Michelle. Thank you again for supporting us. Thank you again for the folks who fed us and where all the food came from. Liz and Aaron and Robin, the entire team, thank you very much. Alexa, Sarah, Debbie, thank you all again. And to you all, safe travels to wherever you're going next. We're never far, we're always in community, so come find us. But have a great day.
Bobby, we start at 8:30 tomorrow?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep, 8:30.
Thank you.
Yep. All right, friends, we'll see you soon.